Hello there, and welcome to Just About Earth, where curiosity takes its time and wonder feels no need to rush. Tonight we'll be wandering somewhere quieter, deeper, and older than most stories dare to go. A place where stone speaks, not with words, but with patience. Where the ground itself remembers things we've long forgotten. You might call it the memory of the earth, if such a thing can exist. These are the moments when the world feels like it's trying to tell us something, if only we knew how to listen. So wherever you are tonight, whatever time it might be in your part of the planet, take a slow breath, settle in, and let's listen together. If this kind of calm curiosity feels like home to you, if you find peace in wondering softly about the mysteries of our world, I'd be ever so grateful if you'd give this a like, or maybe subscribe. It helps this little corner of calm find others who might need a gentle space to drift through questions without hurry. Now, close your eyes if you like, or just let them rest on whatever shadows your room holds, and come with me back through time, to a world that might not have been so different from ours, yet still hums with something ancient beneath its surface. Because tonight we're wondering, what if the oldest structures on Earth aren't just monuments, but messages from a civilization far older than we've ever known? It's strange to think that the Earth keeps secrets in plain sight. We walk across them, build cities over them, and even take photographs beside them on our holidays. Great stone shapes, carved and arranged long before any written word, standing silently in fields or buried under shifting sands. The great pyramids of Giza, the weathered circles of Stonehenge, the carved pillars of Göbekli Tepe, the precision-cut terraces of Machu Picchu. They seem timeless, though each of them has lived through the collapse of empires and the rewriting of histories. We often tell ourselves they are relics of our own ancestors, that they mark the rise of humanity's early genius. But sometimes, in the quiet hours of speculation, a softer question arises. What if they are older than that story allows? What if they are not just the achievements of early humans, but echoes left behind by something, or someone, before us? What if these ancient stones are the lingering syllables of a message that Earth's first civilization tried to send? To even ask that question feels audacious, and yet it lingers because of one simple fact. We don't really know how far back civilization goes. Archaeology is, at its heart, a science of fragments. It works backward through shards, tools, bones and foundations, always guessing at the missing pieces. For centuries we've believed that agriculture began around 10,000 years ago, that cities appeared not long after, and that before this humans lived in scattered tribes. But the discovery of sites like Göbekli Tepe has complicated that neat timeline. Its immense stone pillars, arranged with astronomical precision, date back over 11,000 years, long before writing, farming or even pottery were thought to exist. Yet, there it stands, deliberate and complex, the work of organised minds. It asks a quiet, unnerving question. Who built it, and what exactly were they trying to say? When we look at such places today, we often see them as symbols of spiritual or religious life. Temples, shrines, sacred meeting points between people and the divine. But if we allow ourselves to drift a little further into imagination, we might wonder whether such structures were not only built for gods but also for us, for whoever might come after. Messages carved into the crust of the world, meant to survive floods, fire and forgetting. We know that we too try to speak to the future. We place time capsules beneath buildings, we beam signals into the sky, we etch our languages into metal plaques and send them aboard spacecraft. If our own civilization feels the need to leave a trace, would it be so strange if another once did the same? The idea isn't as far-fetched as it sounds when you step back and look at the pattern. Across continents that never met, across languages that never shared a word, humans built in ways that echo each other. The step pyramids of Egypt resemble those in Central America. Stone circles in Britain and Africa mirror each other's proportions. The same celestial alignments appear again and again. Solstices, equinoxes, the rising of Orion, or the setting of Sirius. Some say this is coincidence, or the inevitable result of people watching the same sky. Yet, the similarities can feel deliberate, as though drawn from an older blueprint, a design shared not through contact, but through memory. It's easy, of course, to let mystery swell where evidence is thin. Our minds are wired to see meaning in patterns, even when none exists. But still, there's something haunting about how the world's earliest builders seem to speak the same language of form and alignment. And if these patterns are language, then perhaps we've only learned to read their surface, not their syntax. Stone, after all, is a slow form of writing. It carries weight instead of ink, shadow instead of symbol. What if, somewhere in those arrangements of granite and limestone, there is information waiting to be deciphered? Not words, but ratios, frequencies, geometries that encode ideas in the universal language of physics. Scientists sometimes talk about the golden ratio, the Fibonacci sequence, or harmonic resonance, as if these are not just mathematical curiosities, but the fingerprints of nature itself. They appear in shells, in galaxies, in the spirals of hurricanes and the proportions of living bodies. Many ancient structures, from the Parthenon to the pyramids, seem to reflect those same patterns. Could that be the coincidence of aesthetic instinct, or an inheritance from an earlier understanding? Some researchers have speculated that ancient builders may have known more about acoustics, magnetism, and energy than we assume. There are temples that hum when sound is produced in certain frequencies, chambers that seem to amplify vibration rather than echo it. It makes one wonder whether these sites were designed not only to be seen but to be heard and felt, resonating with the planet's own subtle frequencies. Perhaps the message wasn't carved into the surface of the Earth, but tuned into it. Imagine for a moment that you could step back far enough in time to see the world before cities, before nations, before language itself. What would remain familiar? The stars, perhaps, and the ground beneath your feet. You might not know the names of constellations, but you'd recognize their movement across the seasons. You might not have words for dawn or dusk, but you'd still know when light returns and fades. Maybe this was the original language, the rhythm of light, shadow, and sound, the one that ancient builders spoke fluently without ever writing a single word. Perhaps they built to teach us that language again, to remind us that we're not separate from the planet that shapes us. When we find an ancient structure today, we measure it, map it, carbon date it, and then often file it neatly into a timeline. But sometimes those timelines don't add up. There are blocks of stone cut and moved with precision that seems beyond the tools known to their supposed builders. At Pumapunku in Bolivia, for example, massive stone blocks weighing several tons are shaped with exact right angles and interlocking designs, as if machined. The site is officially dated to around 1500 years ago, but many of the techniques implied by its construction wouldn't be rediscovered until millennia later. Explanations range from lost tools to misunderstood methods, but perhaps it's equally possible that knowledge itself is what was lost. Not just the methods of shaping stone, but the entire worldview that made such efforts meaningful. It's easy to forget that the Earth itself changes on scales that make human memory seem brief. Entire landscapes rise and sink. Rivers shift course. Ice ages come and go. In that vast motion, it's possible for civilizations to rise and vanish without leaving much behind. Archaeologists have only explored a fraction of the seabed, and much of our planet's coastal history now lies underwater, where ancient shorelines were drowned after the last glacial melt. There, beneath layers of sediment, might be the remnants of the earlier cities, harbours, walls, perhaps even inscriptions long erased by salt and time. If we ever find them, what will we call them? Lost civilizations, or the first authors of our story? There's a quiet humility that comes with that thought. We like to think of ourselves as the pinnacle of progress, the first to reach this level of understanding. Yet, what if we are merely the latest? What if civilization, like the tides, rises and falls in long, slow rhythms, each wave erasing the footprints of the one before? If so, then the ruins we marvel at might not be the beginning of human history, but its echoes, reverberating across ages. The stones would not be mysterious because they are inexplicable, but because they are reminders that history is not a straight line, but a circle. And somewhere in that circle, someone before us might have already wondered the same thing we're asking now. When you stand before an ancient monument, something inside you stirs. You feel the weight of the years pressing down through the rock, the strange sensation that these structures were not built just to exist, but to endure. Perhaps endurance was their message, to remind whoever came next that we are not alone in time, that others have stood in the same wind, looked up at the same sky, and felt the same questions about who we are and where we came from. Maybe that's the message the Earth has been carrying in its stones all along, not a secret code or hidden technology, but a whisper of continuity, a reassurance that even in our forgetting, we are remembered. And so, as we begin to drift deeper into this story, as we let our minds wander through fields of standing stones and beneath the shadow of pyramids, we might listen differently. Not for answers, but for resonance. Because when something ancient calls to us, perhaps what we're hearing is not just history but recognition. Maybe the builders and we are connected by the same impulse, to create, to record, to leave behind something that says, we were here. The Earth might be full of such inscriptions, written not in language but in landscape. And the more we listen, the more the planet itself begins to sound like a storyteller, one who has been speaking since long before we arrived to give it words. So as you lie there tonight, listening to these thoughts drift through the quiet, imagine the Earth as an old being, humming softly beneath you. The mountains, the oceans, the ruins, all part of one immense conversation. Perhaps every monument, every alignment, every echo carved in stone is simply a continuation of that dialogue. And if we slow down long enough, we might begin to hear what it's been saying all along. Not through speech or symbol, but through the steady rhythm of creation and decay, the rise of civilizations and their return to dust, the pulse of time that beats beneath everything. Maybe the question isn't whether these structures are messages from Earth's first civilization, but whether we, in rediscovering them, are finally replying. If you close your eyes and picture an ancient landscape, long before the weight of the modern cities, it's remarkable how quickly your imagination fills the silence. You might see wide plains brushed with golden grass, a distant line of hills, and the slow rhythm of wind moving through the air. Somewhere in that emptiness stands a shape that doesn't quite belong, a pattern too deliberate to be the work of chance. Maybe it's a ring of stones, tall and weathered, their edges softened by rain and time. Maybe it's a staircase carved into a cliff, leading nowhere now, but once carrying footsteps toward meaning. These are the whispers left behind by those who came before us, faint traces of intention carved into the bones of the earth. They stand not only as evidence of ancient skill, but as questions that have somehow survived the forgetting. Human beings have always built things that outlast them. It seems to be part of our nature. We make shelters first, then monuments, then stories made of stone. Each one is a statement of presence, a declaration that says we were here, even if no one remembers our names. That instinct might go back far further than we realize. The oldest known structures on Earth, some discovered only recently, already display a sense of geometry and orientation that feels almost modern. They face the rising sun, trace the stars, align with the solstices as if their builders were mapping not just the land but the very rhythm of the sky. When we visit them now, we call them sacred, mysterious, or ceremonial. But perhaps that's only because we've forgotten the language they spoke. Some archaeologists call this deep history, the part of our past so far removed that it seems almost mythical. In places like Turkey's Göbekli Tepe, dating back more than 11,000 years, Towering stone pillars carved with animals and symbols rise from the earth in circles of almost architectural perfection. When it was first uncovered, scientists were forced to redraw the entire story of civilization. They had believed that temples came after agriculture, that spiritual or communal buildings appeared only once people settled down. But Göbekli Tepe predates farming. It suggests the opposite, that it was gathering around such sites, perhaps for shared ritual or story, that inspired humans to stay, to plant, to begin the long experiment of settlement. If that's true, then architecture didn't grow out of civilization. Civilization might have grown out of architecture. The place itself was the teacher. The structure was the message. Other sites, scattered across continents, tell similar stories. The great stone circles of Nabta Playa, now swallowed by the Egyptian desert, once stood beside an ancient lake around 7,000 years ago. They align with the stars and seasons, marking solstices and lunar cycles long before written calendars existed. In the hills of Malta, enormous megalithic temples appear to have been built by a culture that left behind no writing and vanished without a trace. Their stones are carved with spirals and motifs that repeat in distant places, as if echoing a forgotten visual vocabulary shared across oceans. Each site raises the same quiet question. How did people who had so little in common create in such similar ways? The temptation is to imagine contact, to think of travellers moving between continents, carrying ideas like seeds, planting them wherever they landed. That image is appealing, but perhaps there's something more fundamental at work. Maybe these similarities arise not from shared communication, but from shared perception. The sky above Egypt is the same sky above Peru. The arc of the sun is constant, the sweep of stars familiar. If you were to watch those patterns for long enough, you might start to see connections. You'd notice how the rising of one star marks the flooding of a river, how the shadow of a stone moves differently in summer than in winter. And if you were a builder trying to honour or predict those changes, you'd arrange your stones accordingly. In doing so, you'd create the same alignments another group might build halfway around the world. The earth itself is the teacher, and humanity the attentive student. Still, even with that explanation, something about these sites feels too deliberate, too coordinated to dismiss as mere coincidence. The precision of angles, the scale of movement, the shared motifs, they suggest not just awareness but purpose. Take the pyramids, for instance. The Great Pyramid at Giza is aligned almost perfectly to true north, with an error of less than a tiny fraction of a degree. To achieve that without modern instruments would require both an understanding of the stars and a capacity for measurement that conventional history doesn't easily allow for. Similar alignments appear at Teotihuacan in Mexico, at Angkor Wat in Cambodia, and even in the layout of ancient cities in South America. The same directions, the same mathematical relationships, as if the builders were guided by an underlying principle that transcended geography. It's possible, of course, that the principle was simply observation. Ancient people may have spent generations tracking the heavens, learning by repetition and refinement. But it's also possible that these alignments carried meaning beyond the practical. In many cultures, the stars were not just markers of time, they were symbols of origin. To build in harmony with the sky was to build in harmony with the source of life itself. If the heavens were home to gods, ancestors, or creators, then aligning with them was a form of reverence, a way of keeping contact. Perhaps what we see in those monuments is not just science, but devotion, a form of communication that sought to link Earth to something greater. And if those who built them saw themselves as descendants of an earlier world, perhaps they were echoing what they believed had already been taught long ago. The notion of an earlier civilization isn't new. Many myths hint at it. Flood stories appear in dozens of cultures, Sumerian, Greek, Hindu, Native American, all speaking of a world erased and reborn. The names differ: Atlantis, Mu, Lemuria, Zep Tepi. In every case, the story carries the same rhythm. A golden age ends, the earth shifts, the oceans rise, and knowledge is lost. The survivors scatter, leaving only fragments. For centuries, scholars have dismissed these as allegories, cautionary tales about human pride or natural cycles. But when we look at the geological record, we find that massive floods did occur around the end of the last ice age, when melting glaciers caused sea levels to rise dramatically. Whole regions that were once inhabited now lie beneath the water. Could those memories, passed down and reshaped through millennia, be recollections of real events? And if they were, then the people who built the earliest monuments might have been rebuilding, not beginning. That idea unsettles the neat progression of history. It suggests that knowledge might be cyclical, that humanity has climbed this ladder before and fallen, leaving traces behind like shells on an old shoreline. If so, then the monuments we see today could be fragments of a message passed through ages saying, "Remember us. Remember what we learned." Of course, evidence for a global civilization remains speculative. There's no single artifact that proves connection. But there is something deeper than proof. The pattern of persistence. The way humanity keeps returning to stone, to stars, to the impulse to measure, align, and endure. Even in the absence of memory, we repeat the same gestures as though guided by a resonance that echoes through our DNA. If you walk among the ruins of these ancient sites, you notice something subtle. The air feels different. Sound behaves differently, carrying with a depth that seems out of proportion to the space. Some archaeologists studying the acoustics of stone chambers have found that certain frequencies resonate perfectly within them. A low hum, a chant, a drum beat. It reverberates as though the structure itself is singing back. It raises the possibility that these places weren't only visual but auditory, designed to interact with the human voice, perhaps even with the vibrations of the earth itself. In some traditions, sound is the first element of creation, the origin of form. If the builders believed that, then carving the earth to resonate might have been their way of speaking to it, of joining its ancient conversation. It's also possible that these structures served as archives, not in the way we store words, but in the way we store information through geometry and proportion. The ancients may have understood that certain shapes, ratios, and alignments express universal truths independent of language or culture. A triangle remains a triangle no matter where you are or what century you live in. The ratio between a circle's circumference and its diameter, the constant we call pi, is as timeless as gravity. Perhaps the builders encoded such constants deliberately, not as math, but as message. A way of saying, we knew this too. It's a kind of intellectual fingerprint, a signal to any future civilization capable of recognizing it. To modern scientists, these ideas often sound fanciful. They prefer explanations grounded in evidence, not intuition. And they're right to be cautious. Human imagination is notorious for filling gaps with invention. Yet, there's something to be said for listening to intuition in the face of mystery. Every scientific discovery begins as a question, often one that sounds impossible at first. The idea that continents drift, that light can bend, that time itself stretches. Each of these was once considered absurd. Perhaps the notion of an ancient message hidden in architecture is another such absurdity, waiting for the right perspective to make sense. And there's another kind of evidence that's harder to measure, the human response. Why do we feel awe when we stand before these monuments? Why do we instinctively lower our voices, slow our movements, and sense that we're in the presence of something greater? Maybe it's reverence, or maybe it's recognition. Something in us responding to a frequency we can't quite name. It's as though these places were designed not just to be seen, but to be felt. Their patterns triggering a memory older than history. Some visitors describe it as déjà vu, the sensation of returning somewhere familiar. Perhaps that's what the whisper from the distant past really is. Not sound, but memory resonating through time. When archaeologists uncover a site, they peel back layers of earth, each one representing years or centuries. But beneath those layers are others still unexcavated, lost to deeper time. The planet's surface is constantly recycling itself through tectonic movement and erosion. Whole civilizations could have existed, vanished, and been buried long before the oldest ruins we know. It's a humbling thought that what we call the beginning of history might only be the latest uncovered layer of a much older story. And if the Earth has been keeping such stories, then perhaps the whisper we hear now is only the faintest echo of a much louder message once spoken. There's a quiet comfort in that possibility. It reminds us that we are part of a continuum, that our achievements and mysteries alike are built on foundations laid by hands we'll never know. Maybe the purpose of these monuments was never to reveal a secret, but to preserve wonder, to remind whoever came next that the world is older, stranger, and wiser than it appears. If so, then the whisper from the past isn't saying, "Look what we did." It's saying, "Look how much there is still to learn." So as we continue walking through this landscape of stone and silence, we begin to notice that the whisper doesn't come from the monuments alone. It comes from within us too, from the same urge to understand, to build, to reach out across time. Every new discovery, every excavation, every curious gaze turned toward an ancient ruin is part of that same conversation. The past calls, and we answer, even if the words have changed. Somewhere in the balance between skepticism and wonder lies the truth, waiting patiently, like a buried foundation just beneath the soil. And as the night deepens around us, the stones seem to lean closer, as though eager to tell the rest of their story. Patterns have a way of pulling us in. Once you notice them, you can't help but start looking for more, tracing connections that may or may not exist, trying to make sense of repetition. The human brain is wired that way. It finds order in chaos, shape in clouds, faces in shadows. We like symmetry, we like meaning, and perhaps that's part of what draws us to the ancient world. Because the deeper we look at the remnants of early architecture, the more those remnants begin to arrange themselves into patterns too deliberate to dismiss, too universal to ignore. Across continents and millennia, from the deserts of Egypt to the jungles of Central America, from the hills of Scotland to the plains of China, we find geometry repeating itself. Triangles, circles, squares, spirals. They appear again and again, carved in stone, aligned with the stars, etched into artifacts that span thousands of years and thousands of miles. The first time someone noticed it, they probably felt what we all feel when we recognise a pattern. That soft pulse of curiosity that says, "This means something." But what does it mean, really? Is it a coincidence born of limited design choices and human instinct? Or is it a whisper of something older and shared? A memory that has outlived its makers? When early archaeologists began mapping ancient structures, they weren't looking for patterns at all. They were collecting data, dimensions, coordinates, measurements. Yet, as more and more sites were charted, curious coincidences began to emerge. Monuments separated by oceans seemed to share not only similar proportions but similar orientations. Many faced cardinal directions with astonishing precision. Others tracked solar and lunar events so accurately that they could function as calendars even today. And perhaps most strikingly, certain sites seemed to line up with one another across vast distances, forming alignments that, depending on how you look at them, might be random, or might be deliberate beyond anything we've imagined. For instance, if you draw a line across the globe connecting the Great Pyramid of Giza, the Nazca lines in Peru and Easter Island, you'll find they all lie close to the same circle that wraps around the Earth, a near-perfect great circle path tilted just off the equator. Some researchers dismiss it as coincidence. Others suggest ancient navigators may have used knowledge we've since lost. Whatever the truth, it's difficult not to be intrigued by the precision. These weren't small backyard projects. They were massive undertakings, requiring resources, planning, and an understanding of geometry that modern humans only rediscovered much later. Some of the earliest builders appear to think in terms of harmony. Ratios repeat across cultures. The same relationships between height and base, between radius and circumference, between light and shadow. Many of these ratios align with natural constants, the golden ratio, pi, even the geometry of sound waves. In ancient Egypt, the pyramid's slope approximates the angle that occurs when you square the circle, a geometric expression of unity between heaven and earth. Thousands of years later in Central America, the Pyramid of the Sun follows a similar principle. Could two civilizations, separated by oceans and time, have arrived at the same numbers purely by chance? Maybe. But then again, maybe they were both drawing from the same source, not a lost culture necessarily, but the shared mathematics of the natural world. Mathematics, after all, is the language of pattern. It's the way the universe organizes itself. Spirals in galaxies follow the same proportions as spirals in seashells. The branching of trees mirrors the structure of lungs, rivers, and lightning. When ancient builders aligned their monuments with these patterns, perhaps they were tuning into something fundamental, a sense that the universe itself has rhythm and that architecture could harmonize with it. Some temples seem to amplify this harmony through acoustics. A single clap in the main plaza at Chichen Itza, for example, echoes back as the chirp of a quetzal bird, this sacred creature of the Maya. Engineers say it's the result of sound waves bouncing off the stepped pyramid's terraces, but there's a strange coincidence there too. The builders could not have tested that echo without finishing the entire structure first, which means they either discovered it by chance or planned it with knowledge of resonance centuries ahead of its time. There are many more such details scattered like breadcrumbs across continents. The Great Pyramid's base perimeter divided by twice its height gives a close approximation of pi, a ratio that wouldn't be formally defined until long after the pyramid was built. The megalithic site of Stonehenge mirrors the 56-year lunar cycle, tracking eclipses with a precision that modern astronomy only confirmed in recent decades. In the Andes, the walls of Sacsayhuaman interlock with such exactness that a blade of grass can't pass between the stones, and yet the structure still withstands earthquakes better than many modern buildings. Each site alone might be explained by ingenuity. Taken together, they start to look like verses of a larger composition, variations on a theme. When you see a pattern forming, it's tempting to believe there's intent behind it. Maybe that's our instinct for story. We assume that order implies intelligence. It's what helps us read meaning into the randomness of stars or find constellations in the night sky. Ancient people did the same thing, of course, but they didn't separate art from science the way we do. To them, numbers and forms were sacred, alive with meaning. Geometry wasn't abstract, it was divine. It expressed balance, proportion, the harmony between spirit and matter. To carve a circle or a triangle wasn't just design, it was ritual, a physical act of reverence. And perhaps, across generations, those shapes became the way knowledge was passed down, not through words, but through form itself. Consider the triangle, stable, simple, endlessly useful. It appears everywhere, in roofs, in pyramids, in mountain shapes, in the fractal branching of plants. It's the smallest shape that can't collapse under its own geometry. For early builders, that would have been more than mathematics, it would have been revelation. The triangle represented stability, permanence, and balance. No wonder it became the favoured shape for monuments meant to endure. The circle, on the other hand, suggested continuity and eternity. No beginning, no end. The square embodied the earth, the material world. Together, these forms became the grammar of ancient design. A temple wasn't just a place of worship, it was a sentence written in stone, using geometry as its syntax. But perhaps the most curious pattern of all isn't geometric at all. It's cultural. Civilizations that should have had no contact with one another seem to share myths, symbols, and even architectural methods. Step pyramids in Egypt and Mesoamerica, sun cults on opposite sides of the ocean, similar depictions of serpents, birds, and deities with wings or halos. Skeptics argue that these are universal archetypes, products of human imagination responding to shared experiences like the sun, the sky, and death. Yet it's hard to ignore how specific some of the resemblances are. The feathered serpent god Quetzalcoatl of the Aztecs bears striking thematic parallels to Thoth and Hermes, both figures associated with knowledge and transition between worlds. Are these echoes of human psychology, or the lingering memory of an older tradition, one that seeded itself into myth long before written history? One thing that unites nearly all ancient monuments is their relationship with the heavens. Temples, pyramids, and stone circles are aligned to the rising or setting of specific stars. The Great Pyramid points to Orion's belt. Stonehenge aligns with the midsummer sunrise. The temples at Angkor Wat mirror the constellation Draco. It's as though ancient builders everywhere felt compelled to connect earth and sky, to fix eternity into their architecture. Perhaps they believed that by aligning their structures to the cosmos, they were anchoring their civilizations in something that would never fade. Or perhaps they were copying what they had once seen, a design passed down from a time when the boundaries between earth and sky felt thinner. Some modern researchers take this further, suggesting that these global patterns might indicate a form of ancient knowledge sharing, not necessarily through direct contact but through inherited memory. Carl Jung might have called it the collective unconscious, a shared store of archetypes and instincts that shape human creativity. If that's true, then maybe the patterns in ancient architecture aren't coincidences or evidence of lost technology, but the visible expression of something deeper in us, a drive towards symmetry, proportion, and cosmic order. A drive that reappears no matter where or when humans build. The question then is whether that drive originated within us, or whether it was taught. There's a theory among some archaeologists that culture evolves in jumps, not in steady lines. Periods of rapid advancement follow long ages of stagnation, as if ideas arrive all at once, too quickly to have developed through slow experimentation. The sudden emergence of agriculture, writing, architecture, and astronomy within a few thousand years could be one such leap. It's as though a light switched on somewhere, illuminating the same pattern across distant lands. Perhaps that's coincidence, or perhaps it's inheritance, knowledge resurfacing after a long darkness. If a civilization once existed that reached a high level of understanding, then collapsed, what would remain? Maybe not their language or their tools, but their symbols, their geometry, their orientation toward the stars. Those would survive in myth, in stone, in pattern. When we find the same proportions repeated in temples separated by oceans, we tend to reach for practical explanations, independent invention, shared instinct, and perhaps that's enough. But if we allow ourselves to look just slightly beyond the practical, we might sense that these patterns are more than just coincidences of design. They're attempts at continuity. The builders may have known that civilizations fall and that words fade, but numbers, ratios, and shapes endure. They may have chosen geometry as their language precisely because it's immune to translation. 2 + 2 is always 4, no matter the tongue. The square root of 2 remains irrational, no matter the culture. The golden ratio appears whether you're measuring a temple, a seashell, or a galaxy. To speak in patterns is to speak in permanence. Some see in this a kind of humility, others see ambition. The idea that architecture can communicate across ages assumes both that someone will listen and that the message will outlast the noise of time. When you stand before a megalithic wall, perhaps you're standing before an equation. Not one written in numbers, but one expressed in stone, the sum of observation, intention, and belief. Maybe the builders weren't trying to tell us how to live, but how to look for balance, for proportion, for harmony between earth and sky. Maybe they were trying to remind us that our place in the cosmos isn't separate, but part of the pattern itself. Modern science still searches for patterns, though in different ways. Astronomers scan the sky for repeating signals that might indicate intelligent life. Physicists look for patterns in particle behavior, in the cosmic microwave background, in the curvature of space-time. Biologists trace patterns in DNA. Mathematicians search for them in prime numbers. In that sense, we're not so different from the people who built pyramids or circles of stone. We're still listening for the same harmony, still drawn to repetition, still hoping that behind all the noise there's a structure that makes sense. Perhaps that's what unites us across ages, this need to find order, even when we can't be sure what it means. It's possible that the puzzle of patterns will never be solved, and maybe it isn't meant to be. Perhaps it exists simply to remind us that there's more to learn. Each discovery leads to another question, each coincidence invites another hypothesis. And in that process of curiosity, we recreate the same impulse that may have driven the first builders to lift their stones into alignment with the stars. The puzzle, in that sense, is alive. It moves with us, changes with us, evolves as we do. And somewhere within it, the faint echo of that first question persists. The one whispered through geometry, through proportion, through the slow language of stone. What if we are not the first to wonder? What if the pattern is not random but memory, repeating itself, waiting for us to notice? The stones do not answer, of course. They never have. They simply stand there, patient as always, casting their shadows across the ground as the sun passes overhead. But if you spend enough time with them, watching those shadows shift, you begin to realize something. The pattern isn't only in the stones, it's in the movement of light across them, in the rhythm of seasons, in the pulse of time itself. It's everywhere, waiting for eyes calm enough to see it. And once you see it, it's hard to unsee. You start to wonder what other patterns are hiding in plain sight, what other messages are being written not in language but in the quiet, deliberate symmetry of the world. And maybe that's the real gift of these ancient builders. Not the monuments themselves, but the mindset they invite. They teach us to look, to measure, to connect, to see relationships where others see separation, to understand that the universe, for all its chaos, has structure. That pattern is not an illusion, but a truth repeating itself in every scale, from the spiral of a galaxy to the curl of a fern. And that perhaps the earliest civilizations weren't trying to solve the puzzle at all. They were simply recording it, honouring it, ensuring that when the next curious minds came along, they'd find the same clues and start wondering all over again. So the pattern continues, not just in stone, but in us, in every thought that reaches backward for meaning, in every discovery that reflects something ancient. The puzzle is endless, but not unsolvable. It doesn't demand an answer, only attention. And as long as we keep noticing, keep tracing, keep building, the conversation between past and present remains unbroken. Somewhere out there, in the silent alignment of stars and stones, the oldest message of all may still be waiting, patient as ever, for someone to listen just a little more closely. When you stand before an ancient wall, your first instinct might be to measure its height, count its stones, or admire the craftsmanship that's kept it standing through centuries of wind and rain. But after a while, if you stay long enough, something quieter begins to happen. The sound of your own thoughts fades, and the stillness of the structure starts to feel almost communicative. Not in words, of course. There's no voice in the way we usually think of one, no whispering wind forming syllables against the rock. But there's presence and intention, and something that feels very much like meaning. The stones seem to be saying something, even if you can't yet tell what it is. That feeling might be the oldest form of conversation humans ever had. Before language, before writing, before even shared myths, there was the act of placing one stone atop another with purpose. To make shelter, to mark territory, to honour the dead, or to reach toward the sky. Stone was the first canvas, and in a sense the first archive. It carries information that survives beyond the lifespan of any builder. It outlasts weather, war, and forgetting. It holds its message even when the code is lost. And perhaps that's why it has always been our favourite material for things we want to last. From the first cairns left to mark a trail to the great monuments of history, Stone speaks the same language: endurance. But endurance alone isn't meaning. What makes these constructions so fascinating is that they seem to carry messages we still half recognise, as though written in a dialect we once knew but have since forgotten. The carvings at Göbekli Tepe, for instance, depict animals and symbols that seem to form a kind of narrative. A fox here, a vulture there, hands without bodies, shapes that may represent constellations. Scholars debate their interpretation endlessly, but the carvings themselves remain mute, refusing to resolve into a clear translation. The same is true for the great stone faces of Easter Island, the moai staring inland as though guarding something we can't see. Their builders left no writing to explain them. The island's oral histories hint at reasons, but the stones themselves are the truest record, and they remain undeciphered. The idea that stone can communicate isn't metaphorical. Modern research into lithography, resonance, and structural acoustics shows that certain stones can carry sound or vibration in ways that might have been known, if only intuitively, to ancient builders. Some chambers carved in solid rock resonate at frequencies close to the human heartbeat, creating sensations of depth and presence when sound is introduced. In others, a single word spoken aloud seems to return multiplied, layered, as if the structure itself were replying. It's difficult to say whether such effects were planned or accidental, but the precision of construction in many ancient sites suggests intent. These weren't random arrangements, they were tuned spaces, engineered not only for stability but for interaction. Think of the Great Pyramid's King's Chamber. Its granite walls are massive, polished to reflect both sound and heat. Researchers who've studied the acoustics of that chamber have noted that it amplifies certain frequencies dramatically, particularly those that match the natural resonance of the stone itself. It's as though the room were built to hum in harmony with a specific tone. That could be coincidence, the byproduct of engineering focused on symmetry and mass. But it could also mean that the builders understood something about how matter responds to vibration. If that's true, then stone wasn't just their medium, it was their instrument. They were composing, not just constructing. This idea, that ancient architecture might encode messages through geometry and vibration rather than words, challenges how we think about communication. Today, we see language as something linear and symbolic. It's sound turned into meaning, meaning turned into script. But stone speaks differently. Its syntax is spatial, its grammar geometric. It conveys through proportion, alignment, and texture. You don't read it so much as inhabit it. When you walk through a temple or circle of standing stones, you're moving through a sentence that was written for the body rather than the eyes. The message isn't contained in any single element, but in how each element relates to the others. Take, for example, the precision-cut stones at Machu Picchu. Each block is shaped to interlock perfectly with the next, forming walls that are both stable and flexible, capable of withstanding earthquakes without mortar. That design is practical, yes, but it's also expressive. It demonstrates an understanding of how stone behaves, how it wants to fit, how it moves under stress. In that sense, it's a conversation between builder and material, one built on respect rather than dominance. The Inca didn't impose their will on the mountain. They collaborated with it, letting the mountain's contours dictate where walls should rise. The message, if there is one, might be about coexistence, a lesson embedded in structure. Similar relationships appear across other sites. The builders of Stonehenge transported bluestones from a quarry over 100 miles away, even though closer materials were available. When those same stones were later tested, scientists discovered they produce ringing tones when struck, like bells. It's possible they were chosen precisely for that quality, suggesting that the monument may have been as much an auditory experience as a visual one. If so, then the language of stone included sound as part of its vocabulary. Imagine standing in that circle thousands of years ago, hearing the stones sing in harmony with the wind. Perhaps ritual there was not about speech or sacrifice, but about resonance, the alignment of sound, structure, and sky. To modern ears, that might sound mystical, but it's rooted in observable phenomena. Every material has a resonant frequency, the pitch at which it naturally vibrates when energy passes through it. Ancient builders may not have described this in scientific terms, but they may have understood it experientially. The pounding of tools on rock, the echo of footsteps in caves, the way certain stones hum when struck, these would have been familiar observations to anyone who worked closely with the earth. Over generations, such knowledge could become tradition, then ritual, then architecture. The resulting structures might have served multiple purposes: sacred, social, and acoustic. Their builders might have believed they were not only commemorating the divine, but communicating with it. If that's true, then perhaps the question of the lost civilizations isn't about missing technology at all. Maybe what was lost was literacy, not in the sense of written language, but in the ability to read the environment. The ancients may have understood Earth's materials and energies in a way we've since forgotten. To them, stone wasn't inert. It was alive, responsive, capable of holding and transmitting information. The great monuments could then be seen as messages written in the Earth's own medium, designed to endure because they were made of the planet itself. In that sense, the builders weren't separate from the Earth. They were using its body as their page. This perspective also explains why so many ancient sites seem to blend seamlessly with their surroundings. The pyramids rise from the desert as if grown from it. The temples of Angkor merge with jungle roots. The statues of Easter Island emerge from volcanic rock native to the island. It's as though each culture understood that for a message to endure, it must be written in the language of its setting. You wouldn't carve a letter in sand if you wanted it to last. You'd carve it in stone, in mountain, in alignment with the stars. That's the grammar of permanence. Modern researchers sometimes find these ideas frustrating because they resist quantification. You can measure alignment, catalogue carvings, and simulate acoustics, but intention is harder to prove. Was the precision deliberate or accidental? Were the resonances functional or incidental? Without written records, we can't be sure. But maybe the point isn't certainty. Maybe the message was never meant to be translated into a single interpretation. Language, after all, isn't just about words. It's about connection. Perhaps these monuments were designed to evoke curiosity itself, to keep each generation listening, looking, wondering. A message that says, remember to ask. And we have asked. For centuries, philosophers, mystics, scientists, and travellers have stood before these stones and tried to interpret them. Some have seen them as evidence of divine instruction, others as proof of forgotten science, others still as art. Yet, despite all the theories, the stones remain unmoved, as if their meaning lies not in any answer, but in the endurance of the question itself. To look at them is to engage in dialogue with time, a dialogue that humbles as much as it inspires. If we think of stone as a medium of communication, then perhaps the monuments we've inherited aren't unique to their builders. They're part of a continuum. The same impulse that drove Neolithic people to raise standing stones drove later civilizations to carve inscriptions, build cathedrals, and send satellites into orbit. We're still speaking the same language, just in different dialects. When we design cities with symmetry and proportion, when we erect memorials to preserve memory, when we build machines meant to last centuries, we're continuing the same conversation. Our materials have changed. Glass instead of granite, circuits instead of carvings. But the desire is identical, to leave a mark, to connect across time. Even now, scientists are thinking about how to communicate with the far future, how to warn civilizations 10,000 years from now about nuclear waste sites, or how to encode messages on spacecraft that might drift between stars. And what do they turn to? Symbols, geometry, durable materials. They etch diagrams of atoms and mathematical ratios into metal, trusting that any intelligent being will recognize those patterns. In other words, They return to the same principles ancient builders used. When you want your message to last beyond language, you use the language of form. That's the continuity that links us to the earliest architects of meaning. So perhaps the monuments scattered across the planet are not just relics of lost civilizations, but early chapters of an ongoing book, one written in stone, continued in steel, and now translated into data and light. If the Earth's first civilization did try to leave a message, it may not have been a story in the human sense, but a demonstration of connection, a reminder that meaning can exist without words, that structure itself is communication. And maybe that's why we find them so moving, even when we don't understand them. When we touch the surface of an old wall, we're participating in the same exchange of energy that the builders once did. Our bodies complete the circuit. Our curiosity revives the conversation. The stone, in turn, answers not with sound, but with presence. Solid, steady, indifferent, yet intimate. It tells us in its own way that permanence is possible, that memory can be built, that silence can still speak. If one day our own cities crumble and vanish beneath soil and sea, what will remain? Probably not our words nor our fragile digital archives, but perhaps our skyscrapers, our bridges, our monuments will endure as the ancients did, mute yet eloquent, waiting for someone to come along and wonder what we were trying to say. They'll measure our alignments, study our materials, speculate on our intentions. Maybe they'll even ask whether we too were trying to send a message to the future, or whether we were simply answering one that had already been sent long ago. In that way, the language of stone never really ends. It moves through time like a conversation without punctuation, passed from one civilization to the next. Each generation adds its own sentence, its own question, its own structure to the dialogue. And though the meanings may shift, the tone remains the same, steady, curious, enduring. It's the one language that doesn't require translation, because it speaks directly to the part of us that recognizes permanence, even in impermanence, the part that wants to know, to build, to remember. If we listen carefully enough, maybe we'll realize that the Earth itself is fluent in this language. Its mountains rise like exclamations, its valleys carve commas into the landscape, its rivers trace sentences that flow toward the sea. Every earthquake, every eruption, every erosion is a revision in the planet's ongoing story. The ancients simply added their own lines, chiseling meaning into the Earth's surface. And now, thousands of years later, we're still reading it, still learning to hear what the stones are saying, still trying to answer in kind. Perhaps that's what they wanted all along. Not worship, not explanation, not mystery, but participation. To remind us that we're part of the same continuum of builders, dreamers and listeners. That even if civilizations rise and fall, the dialogue continues, etched in every wall that endures and every question that refuses to fade. And as the night deepens around us, and the idea of those silent monuments lingers in our minds, it feels almost as though they're still speaking, slowly, steadily, in the unhurried grammar of stone, telling us that the story isn't over. If you've ever stood outside on a clear night far from city lights, you know how the sky can seem almost impossibly alive. The stars are not quiet, not static. They pulse, they drift, they shimmer with motion so subtle you can almost feel it rather than see it. That vast canopy above us has been there for as long as eyes have looked upward. And for most of human history, it wasn't just decoration. It was the clock, the calendar, the compass, the mythology and the mystery all at once. The sky wasn't separate from life. It was the rhythm that life followed. And perhaps that's why so many of the Earth's oldest monuments seem to lean toward the heavens, as if in conversation. To the builders of ancient times, the sky was more than a backdrop. It was a presence. It told them when to plant and harvest, when to hunt and migrate, when the seasons would turn. It gave pattern to chaos and continuity to time. Yet, Beyond its practical uses, it carried something deeper, the sense that everything on Earth was connected to everything above it. The movement of the stars, the path of the sun, the return of the moon. These were not coincidences, they were messages. Every sunrise and eclipse was part of a conversation between the heavens and the ground, between the eternal and the temporary. When ancient people built in alignment with the stars, perhaps they weren't just observing, perhaps they were applying. At first glance, celestial alignment might seem like coincidence. After all, if you build enough monuments, some will inevitably line up with something in the sky. But when those alignments repeat across cultures, separated by oceans and eras, the pattern becomes difficult to dismiss. The Great Pyramid of Giza points almost perfectly north, aligned with the stars that form Orion's belt. Stonehenge catches the light of the midsummer sunrise in its central axis. The Temple of Karnak in Luxor marks the solstice. The Mayan city of Chichen Itza was built so that on the equinox, sunlight creates the illusion of a serpent slithering down its pyramid steps. These are not accidents. They are deliberate calibrations, evidence of a worldview in which the ground mirrored the sky. Imagine what that must have felt like for the builders. There were no telescopes, no calculators, no satellites, only naked eyes and an endless span of time in which to observe. Night after night, generation after generation, people would have watched the heavens and noticed patterns, the return of constellations, the wandering of planets, the rare crossing of comets. To them, these weren't abstract events. They were signs that the universe was alive, that it breathed in predictable cycles. By mapping those cycles onto Earth, through stone, through structure, they were grounding eternity. They were giving form to the invisible. Modern astronomy confirms the accuracy of many of these alignments. The precision with which ancient structures track celestial events is astonishing, often within a fraction of a degree. It's easy to underestimate what that means until you try to replicate it. To align a building with a specific star, you need to understand not only where that star appears in your sky, but also how it moves over time, how precession, the slow wobble of the Earth's axis, changes its position across centuries. That kind of knowledge suggests careful observation over many generations. It implies that ancient builders weren't merely looking at the sky. They were studying it, memorizing it, treating it as a teacher. And maybe the sky really was their first teacher. It's the one constant in every human life. No matter where or when you're born, you see the same stars that someone saw thousands of years ago. You might name them differently, imagine different stories between them, but the pattern remains. Perhaps this continuity gave early people a sense of belonging to something far larger than themselves. By aligning their monuments to the sky, they might have been affirming that connection, saying, in essence, we are part of this. In that way, architecture became a kind of astronomy, and astronomy became a kind of faith. The boundary between science and spirituality didn't exist as we think of it now. To measure the stars was to honour them. To predict an eclipse was to touch the rhythm of creation. It's hard for us, living in an age where data and belief are often separated, to imagine a world where they were one and the same. But perhaps that unity is exactly what gave ancient monuments their enduring power. They are built from both precision and reverence, two forces that rarely coexist today, yet once guided humanity's greatest works. Some of the most intriguing alignments go beyond the predictable paths of the sun and moon. At several ancient sites, the layout of entire complexes mirrors constellations. The pyramids of Giza, for example, are arranged in a pattern that reflects Orion's belt, with the Nile corresponding to the Milky Way. The same correlation appears in the ruins of Teotihuacan in Mexico, where the central avenue runs parallel to celestial paths. This mirroring between heaven and earth isn't limited to pyramids. The temples of Angkor Wat in Cambodia seem to reflect the constellation Draco at the time of their construction. Even the ancient city of Xi'an in China follows celestial patterns in its grid. It's as if humanity, across all its beginnings, was driven by the same instinct: to bring the stars down to Earth, to turn the world into a reflection of the cosmos. Why would that matter so much? Perhaps because it offered a way to understand existence. The sky changes predictably, but it also inspires awe because of its vastness and mystery. To align oneself with it, literally through architecture, might have been a way of participating in that order. If the heavens were divine, then to build in their image was to join creation, to place human effort within cosmic design. The phrase, "as above so below," captures this perfectly. It isn't just mystical poetry, it's architectural philosophy. It means that the structure of reality repeats at every scale, in the stars, in the stones, in the human spirit. When you think about it that way, the idea of ancient structures as messages takes on a different tone. They may not be messages sent to us in the future, but messages exchanged between earth and sky. The builders were translators, turning celestial movement into geometry, starlight into stone. Every alignment, every axis, every carefully measured angle was part of that translation. The monuments became the physical vocabulary of a cosmic dialogue. The sky speaking through light, the ground answering through form. In some ways, we still speak this language, even if we've forgotten its grammar. Modern observatories are our new temples, their domes turning toward the stars in the same reverent motion. We build spacecraft to orbit distant planets, satellites to track the movements of stars. We continue to map the heavens, though we no longer build pyramids to mirror them. Our communication has shifted from stone to signal, but the conversation continues. The impulse is the same: to connect what's above with what's below, to find meaning in the rhythm of the universe. Some scientists have noted that certain ancient sites also align with geological and magnetic features, not just celestial ones. That suggests the builders might have been attuned to both sky and earth simultaneously, to the full spectrum of natural forces. They may have sensed that the two are not separate systems, but one continuous field. Today, we call it the study of geomagnetism, the movement of charged particles and fields across the planet. To ancient eyes, it may have appeared as energy or spirit, something that could be felt but not seen. Aligning a monument might therefore have been about balance, synchronizing the energy of the earth with that of the heavens. If that idea feels abstract now, it might only be because we've forgotten how to perceive what they once could. When we look at the monuments today, stripped of ritual and context, it's easy to see them as isolated works of engineering. But they were never meant to stand alone. They were parts of systems, networks of meaning that stretched across both land and sky. The builders weren't simply stacking stones, they were marking cycles, anchoring time to place. The rising of a certain star, the return of a solstice, the change of the moon's face. These weren't just calendar events. They were reminders that the world moves in harmony, that life and death, planting and harvest, darkness and light are all connected through the same cosmic pulse. To live in awareness of that rhythm was to live in balance. The precision of these alignments also raises another possibility, one that science is only beginning to explore. Some researchers have proposed that ancient builders might have used the stars not only for spiritual reasons, but for navigation and global mapping. By aligning monuments to known celestial coordinates, they could establish a system of reference points that spanned continents. In other words, the sky might have been their map, and the monuments its markers. If that's true, then the conversation between sky and ground was also practical, a way of organising knowledge across the surface of the Earth. It's remarkable to think that the same stars we use to navigate spacecraft were once used to place stones. The scale has changed, but the principle hasn't. We still measure our position relative to the cosmos, still rely on signals from beyond the atmosphere to find our way. And just as ancient builders encoded celestial data in their monuments, we now send data into the stars in the form of radio transmissions and probes. We are in effect continuing the same dialogue, extending it outward instead of upward. If we accept that these ancient structures were built to mirror the heavens, then the question becomes, what were they trying to say? Maybe the message wasn't verbal at all. Maybe it was behavioural, a demonstration that understanding the universe requires harmony with it. By synchronizing their works with the cosmos, ancient people were practicing the message rather than stating it. They were showing that knowledge isn't about control but about alignment. It's about listening, observing, and responding in kind. The phrase, "when the sky spoke to the ground," might sound poetic, but perhaps it's simply descriptive. The sky speaks constantly, through light, through gravity, through the motion of celestial bodies that affect tides, seasons, even biological rhythms. The ground replies through adaptation, through growth, erosion, and the long dance of ecosystems responding to those cosmic cues. The builders of ancient monuments may have understood this relationship intuitively. Their structures were the instruments through which the earth could harmonize with the sky's song. In that sense, every alignment, every carved symbol, every chosen stone might represent a word in a vast and ongoing dialogue. The ancients didn't separate the sacred from the scientific, nor the earthly from the cosmic. They built at the intersection of both. They listened to the sky and answered with architecture, and we, centuries later, are still translating that exchange. When we look up today, we often do so through screens or lenses, but the instinct remains the same. We still wonder who else might be listening, what messages might be travelling across the void, what patterns might be repeating on other worlds. And perhaps that curiosity itself is part of the same communication, the continuation of a conversation that began long before language, when the first human looked up and realised that the sky was not separate but connected. If those early builders could see us now, they might recognise the same drive in our machines that they once expressed in stone, the same urge to bridge the distance between earth and the heavens. The materials have changed, but the longing hasn't. The monuments we send now are made of metal and code instead of limestone and granite, but they carry the same message. We are here, we are listening, and we remember the pattern. So perhaps the sky and the ground are still speaking, and always will be. The only difference is how we listen. The ancients listened with their eyes, their hands, their patience. We listen with technology and data. Yet the dialogue continues, unfolding slowly, quietly, over centuries. The stars still move, the earth still answers, and somewhere in between, humanity stands, translator, witness, participant. The sky speaks and the ground replies, and the story of that exchange is written in every monument that endures, waiting for us to notice the conversation we've been part of all along. If you were to travel to the southeastern plains of Turkey, not far from the city of Şanlıurfa, and stand beneath the dry wind that drifts across the hills, you might not expect that you're standing above one of the most extraordinary discoveries in human history. The ground there looks ordinary at first glance, gentle mounds of dust and scrub, the kind of landscape that hides more than it reveals. Just below the surface lies something that doesn't belong to our understanding of time, a circle of pillars, carved with animals, arranged with precision, and older than any temple, city, or writing we've ever known. This is Göbekli Tepe, and it rewrites almost everything we thought we knew about the beginning of civilization. For a long time, archaeologists assumed that civilization followed a simple sequence. First came the hunter-gatherers, then agriculture, then villages, then religion and art. But Göbekli Tepe breaks that order completely. Its construction dates back more than 11,000 years, long before the dawn of farming or permanent settlement, and yet, here stand monumental pillars weighing several tons each, arranged in circles that form a clear architectural plan. The carvings that decorate them, lions, scorpions, vultures, foxes, are not crude or primitive. They are detailed, expressive, and deliberate. Whoever built this place was already an artist, an engineer, and a thinker, which leaves us with the unsettling question: who were they? And how did they learn to build something so advanced, so early? When Klaus Schmidt, the archaeologist who led the first major excavation of the site, began uncovering the stones in the 1990s, he realized almost immediately that he was looking at something far older than any known temple. The site predates Stonehenge by 6,000 years, and the pyramids of Giza by twice that. It's not just old, it's out of sequence. It suggests that the impulse to build monuments didn't emerge from settled societies. It might have been the very thing that created them. People may have gathered here to build first, and only afterward learned to farm to sustain the builders. In other words, the act of building Göbekli Tepe might have been the birth of civilization itself. And yet, as we try to understand it, the site remains elusive. There are no signs of domestic life, no houses, no hearths, no trash pits, no evidence of long-term habitation. It wasn't a city, and it wasn't a village. It seems to have been purely ceremonial, a place where people gathered and then left, returning again and again over centuries. That alone is remarkable. To organise hundreds of people to quarry, shape and raise massive stones without permanent settlement or written language implies coordination on a scale we hadn't thought possible for that era. It also implies motivation, a shared purpose powerful enough to unite scattered groups into a single task. What was that purpose? Some suggest it was religious, a temple dedicated to gods or spirits. Others think it was astronomical, aligned with constellations or celestial events. There's evidence that the site's builders tracked the stars, particularly Sirius, which may have appeared in the local sky for the first time around the time of its construction. The carvings of animals might represent constellations mapping the heavens onto Earth. If so, then Göbekli Tepe was more than a temple. It was an observatory, a calendar, a conversation between sky and ground. But there's another theory, one that sits quietly on the edge between archaeology and memory. What if Göbekli Tepe wasn't just the beginning of civilization, but a remembrance of something that came before? The site's sophistication, its lack of precedent, and the absence of transitional forms suggest that its builders weren't inventing from nothing. They might have been preserving something, a memory, a story, a structure that had already existed in an earlier age. If true, then Göbekli Tepe isn't the start of civilization, but its echo, a monument not of creation, but of remembrance. To imagine that possibility, you have to step outside the comfortable borders of history. We're used to thinking of progress as linear, that each generation adds to the last in a steady climb from ignorance to knowledge. But the Earth doesn't work that way. Civilizations rise and fall. Knowledge is gained, lost, rediscovered. There's no reason to think humanity is immune to that pattern. If a culture existed before the end of the last ice age, its traces would have been buried or erased by the floods that followed the melting glaciers. Göbekli Tepe might then be a reconstruction, a deliberate act of remembrance by survivors who still held fragments of an older understanding. Even its name, the Potbelly Hill, carries an unintended poetry. It suggests something buried, gestating, waiting to be reborn. The site itself was intentionally covered at some point around 8000 BCE, buried under layers of earth by the very people who built it. Archaeologists still debate why. Some think it was for preservation, others that it marked the end of an era. Whatever the reason, that act of burial preserved it for us, almost as if it had been hidden deliberately for the future. It's a strange thought, that a message could be sent not through survival, but through concealment, that what was meant to be remembered would first have to be forgotten. The carvings on the pillars add to the mystery. Each circle of stones seems to depict a different group of animals: wild boars, cranes, snakes, and insects. Some of the carvings show abstract symbols, H shapes, crescents, and what look like handbags or pouches repeated in multiple places. Those same shapes appear in other ancient art around the world, from Mesopotamia to South America, despite the vast distances and ages between them. That repetition has led some researchers to wonder whether these symbols belong to a shared visual language, one that predates writing by millennia. Perhaps they were the early alphabet of a civilization that expressed meaning through icons rather than words. One carving in particular stands out: a vulture with outstretched wings holding what looks like a sphere or a human head. Some have interpreted it as a depiction of death or of the soul's journey to the sky. Others think it might represent a celestial event, like a comet or meteor impact remembered in mythic form. If the latter is true, then Göbekli Tepe could be a kind of record, a warning or commemoration of an event that reshaped the world. Around the same time as its construction, the Earth experienced abrupt climate changes and catastrophic flooding from melting ice sheets. It's possible that the builders witnessed such events and sought to preserve their memory in stone, encoding their history in symbols that would outlast speech. This blending of the cosmic and the earthly fits with everything we've seen in ancient monuments so far. The people who built Göbekli Tepe might not have separated heaven and earth in their thinking. To them, the stars, the animals, and the cycles of nature were all part of the same system. To carve one was to acknowledge the other. The act of building could have been their way of restoring balance after upheaval, re-establishing order by mirroring the cosmos in stone. The sheer effort involved is staggering. Some of the T-shaped pillars weigh up to 20 tons, quarried from nearby limestone using only stone tools. They were transported uphill, positioned with care, and anchored in pits carved into bedrock. To achieve this required not only physical strength but mathematical and spatial awareness. The builders understood balance, leverage, and alignment. They weren't guessing, they were engineering. That kind of knowledge doesn't appear overnight. It's either developed through long experience or inherited. If it was inherited, then Göbekli Tepe becomes not just a marvel of architecture, but a memory capsule, the physical echo of teachings from a civilization that once existed and then vanished, leaving behind apprentices who remembered enough to rebuild, if only once. When you look at the site today, it doesn't feel like a ruin in the ordinary sense. It feels more like a pause, as if someone stopped in the middle of a sentence and never returned to finish it. Excavations have revealed only a fraction of what lies buried. Geophysical surveys suggest there are dozens more circles still hidden underground, untouched. Each may hold new symbols, new alignments, new fragments of the story. But even with what we know now, Göbekli Tepe already changes the narrative. It tells us that humans were organising, imagining and creating far earlier than we thought possible. It also suggests that art, architecture and belief didn't emerge from necessity. They may have been necessities themselves. People may have built temples not because they had civilization, but because they needed meaning. And meaning, once built, may have taught them how to live together. It's humbling to think that civilization might have started not with survival, but with story. Not with the struggle to control nature, but with the desire to honour it. Göbekli Tepe could be the first recorded moment when humanity realised it could shape its environment in symbolic ways, that it could externalise thought, carve emotion into matter, and turn the invisible into the tangible. That moment would have been both creative and reflective, a kind of awakening. The ghosts of beginnings, as it were, not the birth of humanity, but the birth of its memory. Some scholars have noticed that many of Göbekli Tepe's symbols appear later in Sumerian, Egyptian, and even Mesoamerican iconography. The H shape, the vulture, the serpent, the bag-like symbol, all reappear thousands of years later, transformed but recognisable. That persistence suggests cultural continuity across vast stretches of time and space, as though certain symbols survived independently of language or migration. If that's the case, then Göbekli Tepe isn't just an isolated site. It's the source code of civilization's symbolic system. Every temple, every myth, every ritual that followed could be an echo of its original grammar. And yet, for all its influence, Göbekli Tepe remains mute. It offers no inscriptions, no explanation. Its builders left no names, no lineage, no trace of themselves beyond the stones. That silence is what makes it both haunting and beautiful. It invites interpretation without ever confirming it. It reminds us that the past doesn't owe us clarity. Sometimes it speaks only in suggestion. Standing among those pillars, you can almost imagine the people who once gathered there. Perhaps they came from miles away, drawn by stories of a sacred hill. They carried food, tools, and offerings. They worked together for weeks or months, then feasted under the stars, their voices echoing between the stones. Maybe they sang. Maybe they told stories of the flood that came before, or of the stars that guided them. Then they left, carrying the memory back to their families, repeating the ritual the next season. Each gathering reinforced the story, the pattern, the identity of who they were, builders of something eternal. Eventually, the reason for building may have faded, but the act remained. The structures themselves became the story. Even as memory blurred, the stones continued to speak through their form, preserving what language could not. When the last builders buried the site, they sealed that message inside the earth, where it waited quietly for 10,000 years until we were ready to find it again. When we uncovered it, we expected answers, but instead we found more questions. That might be the truest message of all. Göbekli Tepe doesn't tell us what to believe. It tells us that belief itself is ancient, that the urge to connect heaven and earth, to mark time and remember meaning, is older than civilization. It whispers that we've been building for reasons beyond survival for much longer than we realize. So when you think of Göbekli Tepe, don't think of it as a monument frozen in time. Think of it as a doorway, one that opens backward into forgotten ages and forward into every structure humanity has built since. Its stones are the first words in a language we're still learning to read, the opening line of a story that continues in every wall, every temple, every question we ask about who we are and where we came from. The ghosts of beginnings aren't gone. They're right beneath our feet, waiting to be heard by anyone willing to listen long enough to the silence they left behind. When we talk about engineering, we tend to imagine it as something modern. Blueprints, steel frameworks, cranes lifting beams into the air. The very word conjures progress, invention, complexity. But long before the first modern city rose, long before mathematics was formalized or machines replaced muscle, there were engineers working with materials we barely understand. They had no written plans, no advanced tools, no records of their methods, and yet they left behind structures that remain among the most precise, durable, and mysterious constructions ever made. They are the lost engineers of the world, anonymous builders whose knowledge seems to come from nowhere and whose works refuse to fade as if defying time itself. Every continent carries the fingerprints of their skill. In Egypt, the Great Pyramid of Giza rises with such geometric perfection that modern surveyors still marvel at its precision. In Peru, the fortress walls of Sacsayhuaman are fitted together with joints so tight that not even a sheet of paper can slide between the stones. In the jungles of Cambodia, the temples of Angkor stretch across miles of terrain, aligned perfectly with celestial events and waterways. And in India, the Kailasa temple at Ellora is carved downward out of a single mountain, as though someone decided to release architecture from within the rock rather than build it upward from the ground. These are not isolated marvels. They are part of a pattern, a global memory of techniques that modern science can describe but not fully replicate using the supposed tools of their time. Take the Great Pyramid. It is the last of the ancient seven wonders still standing, and for good reason. Each of its four sides aligns almost exactly with the cardinal directions: north, south, east, and west, deviating by only a few arc minutes, a level of accuracy that would challenge even a modern builder without precise instruments. The blocks used in its construction, some weighing up to 80 tons, were transported from quarries miles away. The joints between them are so fine that they barely register as seams. Engineers have proposed countless theories about how it was built: ramps, pulleys, counterweights, levers. Yet none of these explanations fully accounts for the speed, precision, and scale of the work. It's one thing to move a single heavy stone. It's another to coordinate millions of them into a structure that has stood nearly 5,000 years without losing its shape. What makes the pyramid so fascinating isn't only its construction, but its design. Its proportions encode mathematical relationships that seem far beyond what the builders should have known. The ratio of its base to its height approximates pi. Its perimeter corresponds proportionally to the Earth's circumference. Its orientation aligns with specific stars, particularly those in Orion's belt and the constellation Draco. Whether by coincidence or design, it captures in stone both terrestrial and celestial geometry. If this was deliberate, then whoever built it wasn't merely constructing a tomb or a monument. They were building an expression of cosmic order, using the Earth itself as their medium. The same mysterious precision appears in other parts of the world. Thousands of miles from Egypt, in the high Andes of Peru, the stonework at Sacsayhuaman demonstrates an understanding of material and movement that defies simple explanation. The stones are irregular, interlocking in complex patterns that make the walls incredibly resistant to earthquakes. Modern engineers using computer models have found that the irregularity is actually what gives the structure its flexibility, the way each stone's weight and shape distribute stress evenly throughout the wall. To create that deliberately, by trial and error, without modern tools, would have required generations of accumulated knowledge. Yet the builders left no record of their process, no evidence of chisels sharp enough to shape granite so precisely. Some of the surfaces are polished to a smoothness more typical of machine work than of handheld tools. The same puzzle repeats in countless places. At Baalbek in Lebanon, the foundations of an ancient Roman temple rest on stones so massive that even modern cranes would struggle to move them. The largest single block, known as the Stone of the Pregnant Woman, weighs more than 1,000 tons. How it was transported from its quarry and precisely positioned remains a mystery. The Romans built atop it, but the base itself seems to predate their presence, suggesting that the knowledge to move such stones may have come from an earlier civilization. And then there's the Kailasa Temple in India, a masterpiece not built but carved, cut downward from a single rock face. Its creators removed over 200,000 tons of stone, not randomly, but with exacting detail. The temple is symmetrical, ornamented, and aligned with celestial coordinates. There's no evidence of scaffolding or miscalculation. Every column, statue, and chamber is proportioned as though planned by a mind capable of visualizing the entire three-dimensional structure before the first cut was made. To do this without error would challenge even modern architects equipped with computers. For the builders of the 8th century, using hand tools, it borders on the impossible. The deeper we look into these ancient feats, the more they suggest that the knowledge behind them wasn't fragmented. It was complete, coherent, and global in its logic. Across cultures, the same principles appear: alignment with the stars, geometric ratios, acoustic resonance, and integration with the natural environment. It's as if the builders shared a philosophy of design that saw no boundary between art, science, and spirit. They didn't separate engineering from meaning. They built structures that were both functional and symbolic, both enduring and expressive. That unity might be the clue we're missing. Modern engineering values efficiency and replication, the ability to build quickly and consistently. Ancient engineering, by contrast, seems to have valued harmony. Each stone, each angle, each measurement was part of a dialogue with the surroundings. The builders worked with gravity, with sunlight, with the properties of their materials. They weren't imposing form upon the earth, they were drawing it out of it. Perhaps that's why their works have lasted so long. They were built in resonance with natural forces, not in defiance of them. It's tempting to imagine that such mastery must have come from lost technology, machines or techniques erased by time, and perhaps it did. But there's another possibility, quieter and more human. Maybe it came from patience, from generations observing how stone behaves, how seasons shift, how the sun strikes an angle at noon. Knowledge that accumulates not through leaps, but through long continuity. If that continuity were ever broken, through catastrophe, migration, or the collapse of a culture, much of that wisdom could vanish in a single generation. What would remain are the monuments, standing mute but perfect, their builders forgotten. That idea isn't just romantic speculation. History has already shown how easily knowledge can be lost. The fall of Rome erased centuries of engineering insight. The burning of libraries destroyed mathematical and astronomical texts that took millennia to assemble. Skills like Greek fire, Roman concrete, and Incan masonry were lost for centuries before being rediscovered or reinvented. It's entirely possible that earlier civilizations, ones we have no record of, went through the same cycle. If they rose, flourished, and fell before the end of the last ice age, their traces would lie under oceans or buried beneath miles of sediment, waiting for rediscovery. This pattern of rise and loss could explain why ancient monuments appear so advanced, yet seem to emerge suddenly, without evolution. It's as if each known civilization inherited fragments of something older, enough to build but not enough to explain. They copied techniques they didn't fully understand, maintaining the form even when the function was forgotten. Over time, the meaning of the designs faded into myth, leaving us with rituals and stories that echo what might once have been practical science. The precision remained, but its purpose became symbolic. Consider the recurring motif of megalithic architecture. Enormous stones fitted together as though size itself was part of the message. To modern minds, that seems inefficient. Why use 10-ton blocks when smaller ones would do? But perhaps the choice of mass was intentional, a way to create resonance, stability, or energetic balance. Large stones retain heat, conduct vibration differently, and endure longer. If the builders understood those properties, their preference for size makes sense. They were building for eternity, not convenience. There's also evidence that many of these sites share specific geometric ratios that relate to sound frequencies. At certain temples, sound behaves unusually. Chants or claps echo at harmonic intervals, amplifying in ways that can't be explained by accident. The Temple of the Sun at Machu Picchu, for instance, resonates when struck, producing tones that match known frequencies of human vocal range. It's possible that these places were designed not only to stand, but to sing. Sound could have been part of their function, perhaps for ceremony, perhaps for healing, perhaps simply to connect the human voice with the natural vibrations of the earth. If that's true, then the lost engineers weren't just builders. They were acousticians, astronomers, and mathematicians all at once. Their skill was holistic. They understood that everything, stone, sound, light, and life, is interconnected. To build a structure that harmonized with those elements was to participate in the order of the universe. That's not mysticism, it's observation elevated to art. We often assume that progress moves in one direction, but maybe it moves in cycles. Maybe civilizations rise to great understanding, then fall, leaving behind monuments as reminders that it's possible to live in harmony with forces larger than ourselves. Each new age rediscovers part of that wisdom, building again, forgetting again, in a rhythm that mirrors the tides or the turning of the stars. The lost engineers of the world might not have vanished entirely. They might simply be the parts of ourselves we've forgotten how to access, the patient, attentive, reverent part that builds not just to function but to align with the eternal. When you walk through one of these ancient sites, the feeling is unmistakable. There's a stillness that doesn't come from emptiness, but from balance. The stones feel alive, responsive, almost aware. Modern measurements show subtle electromagnetic anomalies at many of these locations, small variations in the Earth's magnetic field that could affect how we perceive space. The ancients may have noticed these effects naturally, without instruments, sensing where the Earth's energy flowed most strongly and building in those places. Whether through intuition or inherited knowledge, they seem to have known how to choose locations where the sky and ground interacted most vividly. If we could ask them what they were doing, what they were building for, they might not have used our vocabulary. They might not have said engineering or geometry. They might have said balance. To them, a structure wasn't complete when it was finished. It was complete when it felt right. When the shadows fell correctly, when the sound lingered just long enough, when the stones rested as if they'd always been there. That's not superstition. That's sensitivity, a form of understanding that goes beyond numbers and enters intuition, and maybe that's why their works endure. They were not forced into existence, they were grown into it, built with an awareness of gravity, temperature, and alignment that made them part of the landscape rather than separate from it. Modern engineers build to resist nature, ancient ones built to belong to it. The result is longevity that feels almost supernatural, but may simply be the result of deep harmony. It's easy to romanticize the past, but the evidence speaks for itself. Our modern buildings crumble within centuries, while theirs stand after millennia. Our technologies depend on constant maintenance. Theirs rely on simplicity perfected. The lost engineers of the world might not have had machines, but they had something we've largely forgotten: patience, unity of purpose, and an understanding that the truest form of strength is alignment with nature. Their legacy surrounds us. Every time we discover a new site, a buried wall, a forgotten foundation, a stone circle beneath layers of soil, we're reminded that the past was not a straight line leading to us. It was a network, a series of peaks and rediscoveries. We are not the first to think, to measure, to build. We are simply the latest, and somewhere beneath our cities, our satellites and our formulas, we are still guided by the same ancient instinct, to leave behind something that endures, to carve meaning into the earth, to join the conversation that began long before history remembered to record it. The lost engineers may be gone, but their message remains clear. It's written in stone, in silence, in proportion. It tells us that technology without reverence is hollow, that precision without understanding fades, that the most advanced form of engineering is harmony. And as we continue to build upward, reaching for the sky with steel and glass, it's worth remembering that the greatest builders once looked down first, to the ground, to the earth, to the steady rhythm beneath their feet, before they lifted a single stone. Perhaps they were never truly lost at all. Perhaps they've simply been waiting for us to remember how to listen to what they left behind, to recognize that every building, every bridge, every monument we create is another verse in the same long poem they began. We are their continuation, their echoes, and if we listen closely enough, we might still hear their voices in the sound of stone against wind, in the quiet hum of alignment, in the stillness of places that refuse to fall. Every civilization carries with it a memory of the world before itself. It's a strange kind of inheritance, a collective intuition that what exists now was not always the beginning. In every culture, across continents and centuries, there are stories about a lost world, an age when knowledge and harmony flourished, and when the earth was different, younger, wilder, filled with voices we no longer hear. Some call it Atlantis, others call it Lemuria, Mu, or the First Age. The names change, but the rhythm of the story remains the same. A great civilization rises, reaches its height, and then disappears, leaving behind only fragments and whispers. Whether those stories describe real events, or serve as metaphors for human memory, they persist because they speak to something deeper than fact, the sense that history might not begin where we think it does. The most famous of these legends, of course, is Atlantis. The story comes to us from Plato, written around 360 BCE, in his dialogues Timaeus and Critias. He described a mighty island civilization beyond the Pillars of Hercules, the ancient name for the Strait of Gibraltar, that possessed advanced knowledge, powerful technology, and great moral ambition. But over time, its people grew arrogant, turning their wisdom into domination. The gods, angered by their pride, sent earthquakes and floods that swallowed Atlantis in a single day and night. The story was meant as allegory, a lesson about hubris and decay, yet from the moment it was written, readers sensed that it might contain more than philosophy. Plato claimed his account was not invention, but tradition, a story passed down through Egyptian priests who said it was history, not myth. Over the centuries, the idea of Atlantis refused to fade. Explorers searched for it in the Atlantic Ocean, the Mediterranean, the Caribbean, even Antarctica. Each generation placed it somewhere new, mapping their own imagination onto the world. To scientists, the story has long been considered symbolic, but every now and then discoveries resurface that blur the line between legend and reality. Beneath the waves, divers have found traces of submerged cities, stone structures off the coasts of India, Japan and Cuba, dating back thousands of years. Most can be explained by natural processes, but a few defy easy classification. Carvings, steps, and straight edges lie where no civilization was thought to exist. The sea, as always, keeps its secrets, but the possibility remains that parts of the story might not be pure invention. Then there's Lemuria, a name coined in the 19th century by zoologist Philip Sclater, who was trying to explain why lemur fossils appeared both in India and Madagascar but not in Africa or the Middle East. He proposed that a now-sunken continent once connected them, a bridge across the Indian Ocean. Later, mystics and theosophists expanded that scientific speculation into something far grander. They described Lemuria as a lost civilization of extraordinary wisdom, predating Atlantis, inhabited by beings of great height and spiritual awareness who communicated through thought rather than speech. To most historians, those accounts belong to the realm of myth. But the underlying idea that whole continents can rise and fall, that civilizations can vanish without trace, is perfectly consistent with geological reality. The Earth's crust is in constant motion, its surface reshaping itself through time. Continents drift, seas rise, and mountains collapse. It's entirely possible that entire cultures could have disappeared without leaving evidence above the current ocean floor. Beyond Atlantis and Lemuria, nearly every ancient tradition has its own version of a world that came before. In Mesopotamia, there was Eridu, the first city, said to have been built by the gods themselves before the flood. In Hindu cosmology, there were cycles of yugas, vast ages that rise and fall like breaths of the universe, each bringing forth a civilization more advanced or more corrupt than the last. The Mayans spoke of previous worlds destroyed by fire, water and wind before the creation of our current age. The Greeks told of a golden age when humanity lived in harmony with nature, followed by ages of decline. Even indigenous cultures in Australia and North America tell of great floods and the loss of ancestral lands. These aren't isolated stories. They form a pattern, a collective memory of something that once was and is no longer. It's easy to dismiss such myths as invention, yet they often contain details that align uncannily with geological and archaeological evidence. Around 12,000 years ago, at the end of the last ice age, global temperatures rose dramatically. Ice sheets melted, raising sea levels by more than 100 meters. Entire coastlines disappeared beneath the waves. Land that had once connected continents, like the Bering Land Bridge between Asia and America, or Doggerland between Britain and Europe, vanished under the sea. Any settlements that existed there would have been lost. To those who lived through it, the transformation of their world would have been apocalyptic. Oceans rising, climates shifting, animals migrating, familiar lands sinking. No wonder so many myths speak of floods and destruction. If civilization had existed before that event, its memory would have survived not as records, but as stories. Some researchers have suggested that human history might be older than we think. that advanced societies could have flourished before the flood myths we now call prehistory. This idea is controversial, often dismissed as pseudoscience, but it persists because every few years new findings complicate the timeline. Archaeological sites like Göbekli Tepe, discovered in the 1990s, show evidence of monumental construction thousands of years before agriculture. Underwater ruins off the coast of Yonaguni in Japan show structures that, if man-made, would date back to a time when that region was dry land. Tools found in layers of sediment once thought too old for human presence have forced scientists to reconsider the start of organised society. Each discovery pulls the thread of history further back, suggesting that civilization might not be a singular invention, but a recurring pattern. If that's true, then Atlantis, Lemuria, and similar legends may not describe one lost civilization, but many. Each could represent a fragment of an older truth, a cultural memory passed down through survivors who rebuilt in different places under different names. The stories could be like reflections in water, distorted, shimmering, and incomplete, but still pointing towards something real beneath the surface. In that sense, the idea of before isn't about one lost city, it's about the human recognition that we are not the first. There's something deeply comforting about that thought, and also something unsettling. If others came before us, it means our own time is not the peak of progress, but part of a cycle. It means that knowledge and memory can vanish, and that greatness doesn't guarantee survival. But it also means that rebirth is possible, that after every collapse something remains, waiting to be rediscovered. The ruins we uncover today could be the foundation stones of lessons already learned and forgotten. Modern science, cautious as it must be, tends to separate myth from fact, but perhaps they're two sides of the same coin, myth preserving emotion and meaning, science preserving measurement and proof. When both align, a fuller picture emerges. For example, genetic studies show that human populations bottlenecked around the time of the last glacial maximum, suggesting that our species came close to extinction before rebounding. That could easily explain why flood myths appear globally, different groups remembering the same event from different vantage points. The details differ, but the core memory remains, a world destroyed and remade. Some of the imagery in these myths feels metaphorical, yet it might encode real observations. The sinking of Atlantis could describe the submergence of coastal cities after the rapid melting of ice sheets. The fire that fell from the sky in Hindu and Native American stories might record comet impacts or volcanic eruptions. The pillars of light and gods descending could represent meteors, auroras, or the sudden brightness of Venus at dawn. What we call myth could be ancient eyewitness testimony, preserved in symbolic language. And what we call legend might simply be memory translated across generations that lack the vocabulary of science. The idea of lost continents like Lemuria also finds strange echoes in the geological record. While no single landmass matches its description, there have been submerged microcontinents, fragments of crust like Zealandia near New Zealand or the Kerguelen Plateau in the southern Indian Ocean, that once stood above sea level before sinking. These discoveries remind us that the Earth's surface is not fixed. Land rises and falls in cycles measured in millions of years. If humanity has existed in recognizable form for hundreds of thousands of years, it's not impossible that cultures could have thrived in places that are now ocean floor. Still, the fascination with Atlantis and Lemuria isn't only about finding evidence. It's about what those stories represent. The idea that there was once harmony between knowledge and nature, between science and spirit, between humanity and the world. Whether real or symbolic, these lost civilizations embody our yearning for balance. They remind us of what might be possible if wisdom were guided by humility instead of ambition. And perhaps that's why the stories persist. They aren't just memories of the past, they're warnings for the present. Plato's Atlantis fell not because of natural disaster alone, but because of moral decay. The people forgot the harmony that had sustained them. They turned knowledge into weaponry, abundance into excess, curiosity into control. In that sense, the story isn't about a lost city. It's about us. It's a mirror held up to every civilization that begins to believe it cannot fall. And if we listen carefully, it's also an invitation to remember the idea of before, not as nostalgia, but as guidance. In quieter moments, you can almost imagine what those earlier worlds might have been like. Vast coastlines glittering under different constellations. Cities built not to dominate nature but to flow with it. Technologies that use sound and light instead of fire and metal. Societies that measured progress not by conquest but by balance. Whether such worlds truly existed or not, the image of them continues to shape our imagination. It influences how we build, how we dream, how we measure our own achievements. The memory of Atlantis and Lemuria lives on not in ruins, but in the human desire to rediscover harmony. Perhaps, in that way, these myths are messages too, not from another civilization, but from ourselves, echoing forward through time. They tell us that forgetting is part of the cycle, but so is remembering. They tell us that wisdom doesn't vanish, it transforms, waiting to be recognized again. And maybe that recognition doesn't require proof or discovery, but simply awareness. The awareness that we are part of a story that began long before us and will continue long after. When you look at the night sky, the same one that ancient builders once aligned their monuments to, it's easy to imagine those earlier worlds looking up at the same stars, asking the same questions. What lies beyond the horizon? Came before? What happens when the sea rises? Maybe they asked those questions and then answered them the only way they could, by building, by recording, by leaving traces for whoever came next. In that sense, the legends of Atlantis and Lemuria are not just stories of loss, but of continuity. They remind us that the urge to remember is as old as the urge to create. And if one day, far in the future, someone looks back at our own time, perhaps they'll tell similar stories about a civilization that reached great heights, that touched the stars, that built wonders, and then vanished. Maybe we too will become the idea of before, and maybe the lessons we leave, written in technology, in architecture, in memory, will serve as the next reminder. That every age thinks it's the first, and every age is wrong. Every sound that's ever been made still lingers somewhere, if only in the faintest vibration. It's a strange thought, but a true one. When a sound is produced, it moves through air, through matter, through the ground itself. It doesn't simply vanish, it dissipates, its energy carried outward until it becomes too subtle to detect. But it never fully disappears. The earth absorbs it, the same way it absorbs light and heat and the endless motion of the oceans. In that way, the planet holds memory, not written, not visual, but vibrational. It remembers through resonance, and perhaps, in some way, the builders of ancient structures understood that long before we did. If you stand inside a stone chamber, one that has stood for thousands of years, and speak aloud, the sound that returns doesn't just echo, it behaves differently. It feels weighted, as if the walls themselves are responding. Some places amplify whispers until they seem to fill the air. Others cancel sound almost entirely, leaving an uncanny silence that feels alive. These are not random effects. They result from shape, dimension, and material, the invisible mathematics of acoustics. Ancient builders may not have had our vocabulary for it, but they knew it by experience. They felt how stone holds vibration, how air moves through narrow passages, how sound bends around curves. They built for resonance as much as for space. At sites like Newgrange in Ireland, Stonehenge in England, Chavin de Huantar in Peru, and the Hippodrome of Hal Saflieni in Malta, researchers have discovered remarkable acoustic properties. In the Maltese Hippogam, a subterranean complex carved over 5,000 years ago, certain chambers resonate at frequencies around 110 Hz, a low tone that interacts with the human body, causing sensations of calm, focus, or even altered awareness. When sound is produced at that pitch, the walls seem to hum. The resonance amplifies so powerfully that a single voice can fill the entire space, vibrating not just through air, but through bone. Some archaeologists believe this was intentional, that ceremonies there were designed to use sound as a tool for transformation. The same is true at Chavín de Huántar, high in the Peruvian Andes. This temple complex, over 3,000 years old, contains narrow stone corridors that twist and turn like a labyrinth. When conch shells are blown in specific chambers, the sound reverberates through the passageways, creating tones that seem to come from everywhere at once. To the ancient visitors, it must have felt as though the temple itself was speaking. That effect isn't coincidence, it's design. The builders understood how to shape space so that sound behaved like water, flowing and reflecting, merging and splitting. The result wasn't just architecture, it was communication between matter and energy, a literal encoding of frequency. These patterns appear again and again. In Egypt, the Great Pyramid's internal chambers vibrate when struck, producing subtle but measurable tones that align with harmonic frequencies found in music. In the Mayan city of Palenque, a whisper from one end of a corridor can be heard clearly at the other, hundreds of feet away. The Temple of Kukulkan at Chichen Itza transforms a clap into the chirp of the sacred Quetzal bird, matching its exact pitch. These effects might seem like coincidences, but they are too consistent, too specific to be accidental. Across time and distance, builders were using the same principles, shaping stone to speak in sound. It's possible that they were exploring what we now call thematics, the study of how sound vibrations shape matter. Modern experiments show that when sand or liquid is exposed to sound at specific frequencies, it forms intricate geometric patterns. Circles, hexagons, spirals, mandalas, all generated by vibration. The higher the frequency, the more complex the pattern. Ancient builders, observing similar effects in their world, may have realized that sound could organize chaos into order. A drum beat, a chant, a tone. All could bring structure to matter. If that idea seems abstract, consider that we already use sound for precision in modern technology. Ultrasound cleans delicate surfaces. Sonic waves shape materials in laboratories. Even our understanding of the universe describes matter as vibration at different frequencies. Everything resonates, from atoms to galaxies. The ancients may have known this not through theory, but through direct observation, through their hands, their ears, their bodies attuned to the world. If sound can shape matter, then structures built to amplify or manipulate sound are not just spaces, they are instruments. They encode frequency the way writing encodes thought. To enter them is to enter a language made of vibration rather than words. Perhaps that's why ancient ceremonies involved chanting, drumming, or singing. The participants weren't performing for gods, they were activating the structure, turning stone into sound and sound into experience. The architecture and the ritual were inseparable, one physical, one ephemeral, each completing the other. There's evidence that ancient people understood resonance on levels both physical and symbolic. Many cultures describe the origin of creation as sound, a word, a tone, a vibration that called the universe into being. In Hindu tradition, it is Om, the primordial sound from which existence unfolded. In Egyptian cosmology, the god Ptah speaks the world into existence. In Christianity, creation begins with the phrase, "Let there be light," a spoken command. The pattern repeats across belief systems, sound as genesis, vibration as source. It's not difficult to imagine that the same principle guided architecture. To build with resonance was to echo creation itself, to bring harmony from stillness. This connection between sound and structure also explains why so many ancient sites are located on fault lines, magnetic anomalies, or places where the Earth's crust produces natural infrasound. These low-frequency vibrations, often below the range of hearing, can influence human perception, inducing awe, calm, or a sense of presence. The builders may have chosen these locations precisely because they felt alive. The Earth's own hum, the subtle tremors of its tectonic rhythm, could interact with the frequencies generated within the monuments. In other words, the planet was part of the instrument. The structures didn't just sit upon the Earth, they played it. Modern seismology confirms that the Earth constantly vibrates, even without earthquakes. It produces a continuous, low-frequency resonance, a global hum. This vibration, caused by waves in the atmosphere and oceans, oscillates at around 10 millihertz. We can't hear it, but we can measure it. It's the sound of the planet breathing. Imagine, then, an ancient people attuned to that rhythm, aware of its effects even without instruments. They might have built their monuments not only in alignment with the stars but also in harmony with the planet's own frequency. The result would be architecture that participated in both the cosmic and the terrestrial symphony. Buildings that didn't just mark time and space but resonated with them. When you think of it this way, the phrase Earth's memory takes on new meaning. Memory is usually thought of as something that belongs to living beings. Neurons firing, patterns stored and recalled. But on a larger scale, the planet remembers too. It records through layers of sediment, through ice cores, through the magnetic stripes on the ocean floor. It remembers in fossils, in minerals, in vibrations that ripple through its crust. Every earthquake, every heartbeat of sound leaves a trace. If humans have existed for hundreds of thousands of years, then the Earth has recorded every footstep, every voice, every drumbeat. Not in the way we record sound, but as infinitesimal changes in energy and matter. To build with stone, to make it vibrate intentionally, could be seen as writing in that medium. It's as if the builders were inscribing messages not on the surface of the planet, but into its frequency itself. Scientists studying ancient tools have noticed something curious. Certain materials, like quartz, produce small electrical charges when compressed or struck, a property known as piezoelectricity. Quartz is abundant in granite, sandstone, and other stones used in ancient monuments. When sound waves or pressure move through such material, they generate subtle electrical fields. That means a chanting crowd, a drum beat, or even the heat of the sun expanding the stone could cause measurable energy shifts. These effects are tiny but consistent. If the ancients noticed them, the faint glow, the static, the pulse, they might have associated it with life, spirit, or power. They might have learned to enhance it through shape and resonance, creating spaces that amplified the Earth's natural charge. It's a fascinating possibility that ancient structures were more than symbols. They were functional devices designed to interact with energy fields, to store or release vibration, to tune the environment. Modern science is only beginning to explore how sound, frequency, and electromagnetism interact in complex systems. But the idea that ancient builders might have experimented with those forces using intuition and experience isn't far-fetched. They lived in constant sensory contact with their environment, aware of subtleties we've learned to filter out. They didn't measure with instruments, but with attention. If all of this is true, then perhaps the monuments scattered across the Earth are not just messages from the past, but recordings, literal imprints of sound and energy, preserved in stone. Each could hold a fragment of an ancient vibration, like grooves on a record. If we could learn how to play them, to recreate the frequencies they were built to amplify, we might be able to hear the voices of those who made them, not as speech, but as resonance. It would be the Earth speaking through human creation, an archive of vibration that has been waiting for us to listen. But even if that idea remains speculative, there's beauty in it. It suggests that memory is not confined to mind or machine. It exists in everything that vibrates, everything that responds to energy. A mountain remembers the wind that shaped it. The ocean remembers the tides that pass through it. The planet itself remembers the rhythm of life in the faint hum that circles it endlessly. The ancients may have felt this and expressed it in their architecture, not as technology, but as reverence. They weren't trying to harness the earth, they were harmonizing with it. In that sense, sound becomes more than a tool. It becomes a bridge between worlds, between past and present, between human and planet, between matter and meaning. When ancient people built temples that resonated with their voices, they were participating in the same act of creation that their myths described. They were reminding themselves that they were part of the universe's vibration, that to sing or to speak or to build was to join the cosmic conversation. And maybe, just maybe, they understood something we've nearly forgotten, that the universe doesn't communicate through words, but through frequency. If the earth has a memory, then every structure ever built, every song ever sung, becomes part of that memory. The monuments endure not just because they are made of stone, but because they exist in harmony with the world's deeper vibration. They are sustained by the same frequencies that move through the ground and the air and the human heart. In that way, the builders achieved something profound. They wrote themselves into the planet's song. Perhaps that's what we're hearing when we visit these places and feel the strange stillness that seems to hum just below silence. It isn't just imagination, it's resonance, the lingering echo of intention, vibrating through the centuries. And as long as the stones stand, the message continues, repeating softly through the Earth's endless memory. When people look at ancient ruins, they tend to divide into two kinds of thinkers. There are those who want proof, evidence, measurements, context, layers of soil that explain how and why something exists. And then there are those who look at the same stones and feel that there's something more, something that can't be measured or catalogued, a meaning that sits just beyond the edge of reason. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. We need both. We need the scientist with the brush, scraping away centuries of dust, and we need the dreamer who stands back and imagines what the place might have been before the silence. Because understanding the ancient world isn't just about what we find, it's about what we allow ourselves to wonder. That's the archaeology of imagination, the slow excavation of possibility. Archaeology, in its most literal sense, deals with evidence. It asks questions of matter. How old is this? What tool carved it? What people left it behind? But evidence, by itself, can only tell part of the story. The rest requires interpretation, and interpretation, whether we admit it or not, is a creative act. Every reconstruction, every museum display, every theory about the purpose of a monument is partly science and partly storytelling. We fill in gaps with our best guesses, shaped by our own time and culture. The same site can be seen as a temple, an observatory, or a calendar, depending on who's looking. The stones themselves don't change, but our understanding does. That doesn't mean archaeology is untrustworthy. It means it's alive. The past isn't a static thing waiting to be revealed. It's a conversation between what was and what we believe it could have been. Each discovery adds a new piece to the puzzle, but the full picture remains elusive. The danger comes when we mistake our current version of the story for the final one. History has a way of humbling certainty. Time and again, discoveries like Göbekli Tepe or the Antikythera mechanism have reminded us that the ancient world was more complex than we thought. Each revelation pushes the beginning of civilization a little further back, as if the earth keeps whispering, "You're still missing something." The archaeology of imagination begins where traditional evidence runs out. It's the part that asks, what if? What if there were civilizations we've never found because their remains lie beneath the sea or have turned to dust? What if the knowledge encoded in myth and symbol isn't metaphorical but historical, just written in a different language? What if the builders of megaliths and pyramids were not anomalies but inheritors of forgotten wisdom? These questions can't be proven easily, but they open doors in the mind. They remind us that mystery has value, not because it gives easy answers, but because it expands the space in which understanding can grow. For centuries, science and imagination have been treated as opposites. One deals in evidence, the other in dreams. Yet every great discovery begins with imagination. Before the first fossil was named, someone had to imagine that creatures might have existed before humans. Before the first star was mapped, someone had to imagine that the night sky followed order. Even the concept of deep time, the idea that the Earth is billions of years old, was once a leap of imagination. Evidence came later. What we now call fact often begins as wonder. When we apply that to the study of ancient structures, something interesting happens. Instead of seeing them as static relics, we begin to see them as living ideas. They become mirrors for our own perception. Each generation looks at the same stones and sees its own reflection. In the 19th century, people saw temples and tombs, symbols of religion and power. In the 20th, they saw calendars, observatories, and proto-scientific instruments. In our century, we see energy, resonance, and networks of knowledge. None of these interpretations are wrong, but none are complete either. They show how the act of looking shapes what we see. This interplay between observation and imagination is not a weakness of archaeology. It's its heartbeat. The imagination doesn't replace evidence, it gives it context. It allows us to see connections that data alone can't reveal. It asks us to think not just about stones and tools, but about minds, the consciousness that placed those stones and shaped those tools. What was it like to live in a world without machines, where knowledge came from watching the stars instead of measuring them with telescopes? How did it feel to carve a monument knowing it might outlast your entire culture? What ideas were worth that kind of permanence? The answers may not be measurable, but they are essential to understanding why these structures exist at all. The imagination also allows us to question our own assumptions. For instance, we tend to see progress as linear, each age smarter and more advanced than the last. But imagination asks, what if progress is cyclical? What if the rise and fall of knowledge is as natural as the changing of seasons? Civilizations might accumulate understanding until they reach a threshold, then collapse, leaving fragments for the next wave to rediscover. Evidence of such cycles might be rare because the Earth is efficient at erasing its surface. Mountains rise, seas shift, forests reclaim. Over 10,000 years, even the grandest cities could vanish completely. The imagination doesn't insist this is true. It simply reminds us that it could be. There's a balance to be found between skepticism and belief. Too much skepticism, and we lose curiosity. Too much belief, and we lose discipline. The archaeology of imagination sits between the two, grounded in evidence but open to wonder. It asks us to respect what we know while admitting what we don't. It's the same balance ancient builders might have practiced, precision guided by reverence. They measured the stars but also worshipped them. They carved stone with geometry but infused it with spirit. They didn't divide the world into science and faith. They saw both as expressions of the same truth. Modern science often strips mystery from its subjects in pursuit of clarity, but there's value in letting some mystery remain. The unknown isn't an obstacle, it's a reservoir. It holds the potential for new understanding. The moment we decide that a mystery is solved, we stop listening to what else it might have to say. The ancients seem to know this instinctively. Their monuments don't offer clear answers. They invite participation. They ask you to stand among them, to feel their scale, to sense their silence, and to realize that knowledge isn't always verbal. Sometimes it's spatial, sensory, embodied. To truly study such places, we need more than analysis. We need empathy, a willingness to imagine the minds behind the stones. There's also the question of why we keep looking backward at all. Why do we spend so much effort uncovering and interpreting the past when we could be focused entirely on the future? Perhaps it's because the past offers a reflection of what we might become. Each ruin is a reminder that civilization is fragile, that even the greatest achievements can fade. But it also shows that meaning can endure, that even when cultures fall, their art and architecture continue to speak. To study the past is to study resilience, the ability of ideas to outlive their creators. Imagination helps us hear that endurance as something living, not dead. Some archaeologists speak of contextual silence, the vast absence that surrounds what survives. For every artifact we find, countless others have vanished. The gaps are immense. The imagination fills those gaps not with fantasy, but with possibility. It reconstructs the human element that data alone can't capture, the hopes, fears, and intentions of the people who built the world before us. When we imagine them, we restore continuity between past and present. We stop seeing them as primitive and start recognizing them as versions of ourselves. That recognition changes how we interpret the evidence. A carving isn't just decoration, it's communication. A monument isn't just architecture, it's expression. Even the placement of stones becomes an act of thought. The imagination translates these gestures into meaning, giving us access to minds long gone. It's an act of empathy across time. Archaeology not just of material but of consciousness. Sometimes when archaeologists uncover a site, they find layers of rebuilding, each generation adding its own interpretation to the same foundation. A temple becomes a fortress, then a church, then a ruin. Each era sees the same stones differently, adapting them to its own story. That's what imagination does on a larger scale. It rebuilds the past in our minds, layer by layer, using new understanding as mortar. The result is never final, but it's always richer. Of course, imagination can mislead too. It can turn speculation into myth, or myth into false certainty. That's why balance matters. To practice the archaeology of imagination responsibly is to remain aware of where evidence ends and creativity begins. The two must work together. Skepticism ensuring that imagination doesn't drift too far, and imagination ensuring that skepticism doesn't freeze curiosity. The healthiest inquiry is one that moves between both, like breathing. In a way, this balance mirrors the dual nature of the monuments themselves. They are both material and symbolic, both grounded and transcendent. To interpret them, we need both kinds of sight, the analytical and the intuitive. When those perspectives merge, new insights appear. Patterns we once overlooked become visible. Connections that seem coincidental start to make sense. It's as if the act of imagining allows the past to speak in a language we'd forgotten we understood. This idea doesn't diminish science, it expands it. The greatest discoveries often come from scientists who are willing to imagine what others considered impossible. It took imagination to conceive of atoms, of gravity, of galaxies. It takes imagination to ask whether ancient builders might have known things we've only recently rediscovered. About resonance, about geometry, about the interconnectedness of life and matter. Imagination keeps science humble by reminding it that certainty is temporary. If the earth itself holds memory, then perhaps imagination is the tool we use to read it. Each ruin is a page, each artifact a sentence, each pattern a whisper. To study them purely as objects is to read without understanding the language. Imagination teaches us to listen for tone, rhythm, emotion, the subtleties that make meaning complete. That's why, when we walk among ruins, the experience feels so profound. We're not just seeing stones, we're reading the remnants of thought. In the end, the archaeology of imagination isn't about proving anything. It's about participation. It's about standing in the gap between knowledge and mystery, and letting both inform each other. It's about seeing the world not as a series of facts to be catalogued, but as a story still being told. Every discovery, every hypothesis, every quiet moment spent among the remnants of the past adds another sentence to that story. And maybe that's the real message of the ancient structures we keep studying, that truth is layered, that knowledge and imagination are not opposites but partners. The builders of old seem to understand that. They didn't just record their understanding in numbers and shapes, they embedded wonder into the very stones. They knew that mystery itself has value, that questions are sometimes the most enduring legacy. So, when we stand before their monuments today, our role isn't only to measure and explain, but to imagine, to let the mind move gently between what's known and what might be, until the two become indistinguishable. That's how the past stays alive. That's how history continues to breathe. And maybe, somewhere within that act of imagination, we begin to remember something we didn't realize we'd forgotten. The sense that knowledge without wonder is hollow, and that wonder without knowledge is blind. Both are needed together to keep the conversation between ages alive. The stones wait patiently. They don't care which questions we ask or how we answer them. They have seen every theory come and go, but they respond in their own quiet way when we listen properly, when we bring both our instruments and our imagination to the task. They tell us that meaning isn't something buried to be found once and for all. It's something that emerges every time a curious mind looks their way and begins to wonder again. And perhaps that's what archaeology at its heart has always been. Not the study of things long gone, but the study of curiosity itself. The attempt to understand why humans in every era look backward to move forward. The realization that imagination isn't an escape from truth, it's the bridge to it. The stones hold their silence. We bring the questions. Together, they form a dialogue that never ends. For so long we've searched for messages. We've looked to the stars, the stones, the ruins buried beneath the earth, hoping to find something left for us. Some sign that we were not the first, that meaning was carved into the world long before we arrived to ask for it. But what if we've been looking outward when the answer has been within us the whole time? What if the monuments, the alignments, the symbols and the myths were never really meant to speak to the future at all, but to awaken something already present in those who would eventually look? Maybe the message wasn't written for humanity. Maybe humanity is the message. It's an idea that changes the direction of every question we've asked so far. If we imagine ancient civilizations not as distant teachers, but as earlier versions of ourselves, then their greatest lesson might not be in what they built, but in why they built it. Each structure, each line carved into stone, might have been less about preservation and more about reflection. A mirror held up to the human condition, designed to endure long enough for us to eventually recognize ourselves in it. In that sense, every ancient monument could be an echo of the same truth, that consciousness is the enduring artifact, and that meaning was never hidden in the stones, but in the act of searching for it. There's something both humbling and comforting about that. We've spent centuries trying to interpret the language of the ancients, decoding geometry, mapping alignments, reconstructing rituals. But maybe those things weren't meant to be puzzles at all. Maybe they were expressions of awareness, ways of saying, we see what you see, we feel what you feel. If that's the case, then the continuity that connects us across millennia isn't technological or cultural, it's emotional. Curiosity, reverence, wonder. These are the constants of humanity. They transcend time, they are what survive collapse and silence. When you think about it that way, the idea of a message from Earth's first civilization takes on an entirely different meaning. It might not be an external message, buried under rock or encoded in architecture. It might be internal, transmitted through evolution itself, passed not through writing but through consciousness. The instinct to build, to remember, to ask. Maybe we carry that message in our behaviour, in the way we keep rebuilding even after every fall, in the way we feel awe when we stand before something ancient. It's not that we're searching for meaning, it's that we are meaning, temporarily embodied, reflecting the same light in different ages. Consider how human progress has always mirrored the same cycle. We invent, we forget, we rediscover. Each generation thinks it's the first to understand the world, and then time humbles that certainty. But through all those rises and falls, the same pattern persists. The same drive to learn, to create, to reach beyond necessity. That persistence is its own kind of signal. If the Earth could listen, it would hear that signal pulsing across time, transmitted not through machines but through minds. Every culture, every monument, every question adds another layer to it, a continuous transmission of awareness. Science tells us that our bodies are made of the same elements as the stars: hydrogen, carbon, oxygen, iron. We are literally the universe contemplating itself, fragments of ancient starlight that learned how to observe. Perhaps that's why the monuments of the past move us so deeply. They remind us of our continuity with the cosmos, not just as observers but as participants. When we align stones with stars, when we measure the heavens, we're not imitating our ancestors. We're continuing their gesture, a cosmic instinct encoded in our very being. If consciousness is the thread that weaves all of history together, then perhaps the builders of the earlier structures were not trying to send us information, but resonance. They built in harmony with the world because they felt themselves as part of it, and that feeling, that sense of belonging, is the true inheritance. They might not have known our languages or technologies, but they knew the same stillness we find when we look at the night sky and realize how small we are. They knew that to build something lasting was to declare that awareness matters, that existence itself wants to be seen. What's remarkable is how persistent that impulse is. Across every culture and era, humans have created art, music, architecture, stories, not because they were necessary for survival, but because they made survival meaningful. That creative impulse is our shared signature, the mark we leave on the universe. When ancient civilizations built pyramids or carved symbols into stone, they were acting out the same instinct that drives us to send probes into space or write books or record our voices. All of it is the same gesture, a reaching outward, a desire to connect, to leave a trace. The form changes, the message doesn't. If that's true, then maybe we've misunderstood the idea of messages from lost civilizations. Maybe the point wasn't to preserve data, but to preserve being. The builders didn't need to tell us who they were because we already are who they were. Every discovery, every question, every moment of awe is their voice continuing through us. The message is recursive: to exist, to wonder, to build, to remember. You can see this pattern everywhere if you look closely enough. The way a scientist studies a fossil, the way a child builds with stones at the edge of a river, the way an artist sculpts light into form. All are expressions of the same ancient instinct. Each says, I was here, but also, I am part of this. We often separate ourselves from history, as though the past was something behind us, but in truth it's woven through us. The neurons that fire when we feel curiosity are the same kind that fired when the first humans looked at the stars. The sense of wonder we feel at a monument is not nostalgia, it's recognition. Perhaps that's why the search for ancient messages feels so urgent. We're not just trying to learn about the past, we're trying to confirm that our existence fits into something larger. The thought that others before us felt the same longing gives meaning to our own. It tells us that consciousness has continuity, that awareness is not an isolated spark, but part of a lineage stretching back to the beginning of life. In that way, the oldest message of all might simply be, remember that you are not separate. That realization also reframes how we think about loss. Civilizations may fall, languages may disappear, but the essence of what they were never truly vanishes. It reincarnates in new forms, in new minds. The stories of Atlantis, of Lemuria, of the first builders might not be memories of places but of patterns. The repetition of awareness rising, expressing itself, fading and returning. The details change, but the rhythm remains. We are the latest verse in an ongoing song that began long before history and will continue long after. It's tempting to think of ourselves as different from those who came before, more advanced, more rational, more informed. But in the deepest sense, we are the same. We still gather knowledge, still make art, still build monuments. We still look to the stars and wonder who else might be listening. We are still, as ever, the universe asking itself what it means to exist. That continuity is the real heritage of the ancients. It's the invisible thread that connects the stones of Göbekli Tepe to the circuits of a satellite, the hum of a temple to the hum of a data server, the firelight of the first storytellers to the glow of a modern screen. When you think of it that way, it becomes difficult to draw a clear line between civilization and consciousness. Civilizations are just the visible manifestations of thought, the temporary shapes that awareness takes while it learns about itself. When they fall, the awareness remains, reshaping, moving forward. The physical message, the monuments, the inscriptions, may crumble, but the mental message continues in us. We are in effect the memory of the earth, the means by which it contemplates and remembers itself. The idea that humans are the message also transforms how we see time. Instead of history as a straight line from past to future, it becomes a continuum of awareness looping back on itself. The ancients may have intuited this. Their calendars were cyclical, their cosmology circular. They didn't see time as a progression, but as a rhythm, a pulse that repeats endlessly, each beat slightly different but fundamentally the same. Within that rhythm, humanity reappears, again and again, rediscovering what it once knew. Perhaps the builders of the earliest monuments understood that they couldn't send a message forward in words, but they could build one into the pattern itself. By aligning their works with the stars, they ensured that the same configurations would eventually reappear, that new eyes would one day see what they had seen. In that moment of recognition, the message would be delivered, not through speech, but through synchronicity. It's possible that this is happening right now. As we uncover ancient sites, decode forgotten languages, and trace our lineage back through DNA, we are unknowingly activating the very message we were meant to find, the awareness of continuity, the realization that we've been here before in different forms, under different skies, asking the same questions. That awareness doesn't diminish mystery, it deepens it. It shows that our curiosity is not just a human trait, but a cosmic one, part of the universe's instinct to understand itself. If that's true, then perhaps the real question isn't what the first civilization was trying to tell us, but what we are now saying back. Every generation contributes to the dialogue. Our cities, our art, our technology. All of it becomes part of the same message, written in new materials, transmitted in new frequencies. The content may change, but the intent remains. To connect, to endure, to witness. The stones spoke through stillness. We speak through motion. But the voice is the same. In a quiet way, this idea also resolves the tension between science and spirituality. Both are forms of listening. Science listens for patterns in nature. Spirituality listens for patterns in consciousness. Both are attempts to hear the same message through different channels. The ancients may not have separated them because they understood that both are necessary to decode meaning. To listen only outward or only inward is to hear half the story. The complete message requires both, the data and the dream, the observation and the wonder. There's a subtle piece in realizing that we don't need to find proof of some lost transmitter from the past because we are the transmission itself. Every thought, every discovery, every act of creation is the signal continuing. The monuments may have been the first amplifiers of that signal, but it's humanity that carries it forward. When we study them, when we feel awe in their presence, when we build upon their mystery, we complete the circuit. We become the receivers and the senders at once. Perhaps that's what the ancients meant by eternity, not an unending stretch of time, but the endless conversation between consciousness and creation. To exist is to participate in that exchange. The message doesn't need to be written because it is lived. Every breath, every idea, every moment of awareness is another syllable in it. If we are the message, then the purpose of all this, the searching, the building, the remembering, is not to reach an answer, but to sustain the dialogue. The message is curiosity itself, looping through time, ensuring that awareness never stagnates. It grows, adapts, reawakens. And through it, the universe continues to know itself in new ways. Maybe that's what the builders of the ancient world understood better than we do. They didn't carve instructions or histories because they knew those would fade. They carved symbols of pattern, proportion, alignment, universals that would speak to any mind capable of recognition. They trusted that whoever came next would not just see their work but feel it, understand it without translation. That feeling, that moment of shared recognition across ages, is the message fulfilled. And perhaps it's still being fulfilled quietly, every time someone stands before a monument and feels something they can't quite explain. A stillness, a sense of connection, a moment when time folds, and for an instant, the distance between now and then disappears. In that space, awareness meets itself. The past and present become one, and the message continues, not as words but as realization. If that's what all of this has been about, of the searching, the alignment, the remembering, then maybe we've already received what we were meant to find. Not an artifact or a code, but understanding. The knowledge that to be human is to carry forward the same consciousness that built the first stones, asked the first questions, dreamed the first dreams. We are not the recipients of the message, we are its continuation. And so, the search goes on, not to find something lost, but to recognize something constant. Every discovery, every new question, every quiet moment of wonder adds another echo to the same infinite conversation. The monuments endure because the message endures. It was never written to be read. It was written to be remembered by being lived. There's a moment that comes after every discovery, every act of creation, every rise and fall of a civilization. A pause. It's not the end. It's not even absence. It's the stillness that follows sound, the silence that waits between one heartbeat and the next. The earth knows that rhythm well. It has lived through ages of movement and ages of quiet, through empires rising like waves and receding again into the long patience of the sea. In that silence, it remembers. It stores the echoes of everything that has ever been built, spoken, or dreamed. The silence between civilizations is not emptiness. It's the planet taking a breath. When we look at history, we tend to focus on the moments of noise, the building, the conquest, the invention, the flourishing. But those moments are brief. The greater part of time is spent in silence, in the long intervals when the earth reclaims what was made and prepares for what will come next. The ruins we uncover are the punctuation marks in that quiet story. They remind us that even the loudest ages eventually fall silent, and that silence too is part of the message. If you stand in a place that was once alive with human sound, a temple, a city, a field of abandoned stones, you can still feel something moving in the quiet. The air carries memory, faint but persistent. It's as if the ground beneath your feet is still listening for the voices that used to fill it. Wind passes through broken doorways, echoing where music once played. The rhythm of footsteps, the murmur of language, the hum of work, all of it dissolves into a kind of resonance that never fully fades. The silence isn't empty, it's saturated with what came before. It's what remains when time exhales. There's a special kind of peace in recognizing that the earth is always listening. Civilizations may vanish, but their vibrations continue, absorbed into the planet's long memory. Every structure that crumbles becomes part of the soil. Every voice that fades becomes part of the air. Over eons, those traces blend, forming layers of unseen history that shape the future in ways we can't perceive. The silence between civilizations isn't the end of their stories. It's the space where their stories become part of the Earth's own. Perhaps that's why silence feels so alive in ancient places. It isn't just the absence of sound, it's the presence of waiting. The planet is patient. It doesn't rush to replace what's gone. It lets things rest, decompose, merge and transform. What we see as decay, it experiences as renewal. Every ruin becomes a seed. Every fallen wall enriches the ground that will one day hold something new. The earth never stops building. It simply shifts its medium. One age constructs in stone, another in soil, another in thought. The continuity is unbroken, even when no one is there to see it. It's easy to forget that silence is what allows everything else to be heard. Without it, there would be no rhythm, no distinction, no meaning. In music, silence gives shape to sound. In language, pauses give clarity to words. In civilization, the quiet intervals between ages give depth to history. If the earth had spoken continuously, we might never have learned to listen. But because it falls silent, we have time to reflect, to notice, to wonder. In that sense, the spaces between civilizations are as vital as the civilizations themselves. They are the Earth's way of balancing motion and stillness. When the world grows too loud, it finds a way to restore quiet. Through collapse, through change, through transformation that seems destructive, but is in truth regenerative. Forests return where cities fall. Rivers reshape where walls crumble. Silence is the Earth's reset. It is the breathing space that keeps creation sustainable. If we think of human history as a single, long conversation, then each civilization is a voice. Some speak loudly, some softly, some only for a moment. The silence between them is not interruption. It's listening. It's the pause that allows understanding to sink in before the next voice begins. The message we've been tracing across this long thread of time, from the first builders to the lost engineers, from the myths of Atlantis to the resonances of the earth, is not one continuous shout, but a rhythm of speaking and silence, of remembering and forgetting, of asking and waiting. The silence is as much a message as the sound. There's something profoundly human in that. We too live by rhythm, our hearts beating, our breath alternating between inhale and exhale. We speak, then fall silent. We live, then return to stillness. Our civilizations mirror that same pulse, expanding and contracting through time. What we call endings may simply be the pauses that make new beginnings possible. The silence between civilizations is not a void to fear, it's the womb of the next idea. You can see that rhythm everywhere once you start looking for it. After the fall of Rome, Europe entered what some called the Dark Ages, but even that darkness was filled with quiet growth, with the slow fermentation of a knowledge that would one day become the Renaissance. After the collapse of the Mayan cities, forests reclaimed the temples, and within those forests new ecosystems flourished. After every silence, the world renews itself. The pattern holds steady: emergence, expression, quiet, renewal. Sometimes it helps to imagine the Earth itself as the speaker and humanity as the echo. Each civilization amplifies a certain part of the planet's voice, one focused on harmony, another on invention, another on exploration. When that note has resonated long enough, the sound fades, and the Earth begins a new phrase. In that sense, the silence between civilizations is not loss, but transition. The planet is shifting key, preparing for the next variation in its song. It's strange to think that our own time, with all its noise and motion, will one day become part of that silence. The buildings we think of as permanent will crumble. The languages we speak will fade. Even the data we store so carefully might vanish, leaving only faint traces in the fossil record. To future eyes, our cities might look like the ruins we study today. Fragments of ambition, echoes of belief. But that isn't cause for sadness. It's the natural rhythm of being part of a living world. Everything we build, think and feel becomes part of the same continuum. Our noise will one day be someone else's silence. Our silence will make space for new voices to emerge. And maybe that's the deeper message of all the monuments and mysteries we've explored, that silence isn't the opposite of civilization, but its foundation. Without it, we would never have the room to dream, to begin again. The ancients built their messages in stone because they knew silence would follow, and they wanted something to remain that could bridge that gap. When we look at those stones now, we're not just seeing what they built, we're hearing what they left unsaid. The silence is the part of the message that waits for us to listen. Sometimes it's hard to hear because the modern world is so loud. We fill every moment with sound and signal, afraid of stillness. But silence isn't absence, it's presence of another kind. It's what lets meaning settle. It's what connects our time to all the times that came before. When we pause long enough to listen, we begin to notice how much is still speaking. The hum of the wind, the slow rhythm of waves, the low vibration of the Earth's own rotation. The universe has never stopped communicating. We've only forgotten how to be quiet enough to hear it. Maybe that's what the ancients meant by reverence. Not worship of gods or forces, but an understanding of silence. A willingness to step back, to let the world speak. Their monuments, their rituals, their careful alignments were all forms of listening. They tuned themselves to the frequencies of the planet and the sky, participating in the cosmic dialogue instead of trying to control it. We too can learn to listen in that way again. It doesn't require temples or technology, just attention. In the quiet of the night, when cities dim and machines rest, the silence returns, vast and steady. It carries within it all the voices that came before, the builders, the dreamers, the seekers, folded together into one long continuous hum. The silence between civilizations isn't an absence of life, it's the presence of everything life has ever been, condensed into stillness. To hear it is to feel part of something far older and larger than history. That realization can change how we live. If we understand that silence is sacred, we might learn to treat the world more gently, to build not in defiance of time but in harmony with it. We might remember that what we do now will one day become part of the Earth's quiet archive, and if we build with care, our silence might speak kindly to whoever listens next. The Earth doesn't mourn what's gone, it carries it, transforms it, makes it part of what comes after. These stones that once formed temples will become sand, the sand will become soil, the soil will nourish new life. Even the air we breathe contains atoms that passed through countless beings before us. People, animals, plants, civilizations. The silence between ages is made of those same atoms, rearranged, waiting. In that way, nothing is truly lost. Everything simply changes form. Maybe that's why standing among ruins feels so strangely peaceful. You can sense the continuity in the stillness. The way the past hasn't ended, only quieted. You can almost feel the next beginning forming in that silence, invisible but inevitable. The air feels full, not empty. The ground feels alive, not abandoned. This silence between civilizations is the sound of renewal preparing itself. So perhaps the question was never what the ancients wanted to tell us, but how we choose to listen. If we can hear the silence, really hear it, we might understand that it holds all the messages we've been searching for. It contains the memory of what was, the possibility of what will be, and the steady presence of what always is. It tells us that every civilization, every human life, every heartbeat is part of one continuous rhythm that never stops, only changes tempo. And maybe, as the night settles and the noise of our own age softens, we can take comfort in knowing that we're part of that rhythm, that when our time falls quiet it won't be an end but a continuation of the same ancient silence that once followed the builders of pyramids, the thinkers of temples, the dreamers of stars. We'll join that silence, and through it, our own message will remain, not in words or monuments, but in the invisible pulse of awareness that connects everything that has ever been awake enough to wonder. The silence between civilizations is the Earth listening to itself, remembering itself, preparing to speak again, and somewhere within that quiet humanity waits, not apart from the story, but within it, another voice in the long conversation between the world and its own memory. If you're listening now, you're already part of that silence. You always have been.